Hello there and welcome to Ancient Earth Archives, where the mysteries of Earth's forgotten past come to life. Tonight's quiet journey drifts over a sea of golden dunes across horizons that ripple like waves frozen in time. We're going to a place that many imagine as lifeless, endless and empty. But beneath its silence may lie the oldest whispers of civilization itself, the Sahara Desert. A landscape that seems timeless but might be keeping time's earlier secrets. Before we wander too far into the sand, tell me something. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it quiet where you are? Maybe the air is cool, or maybe it carries the hum of late traffic or the soft rustle of curtains. Wherever you are, I'd like you to imagine the desert for a moment. Not as a harsh place, but as one vast sleeping body, breathing slowly under the stars. If you find calm in this little expedition, if the science and mystery help you drift a bit deeper into thought or rest, a like or a subscribe would help this quiet corner of curiosity reach others who might need it too. Now settle in and let's begin. Because somewhere beneath the dunes, long before pyramids and pharaohs, before history learned to write, there might have been people who called this ocean of sand their home. The Sahara today stretches over 9 million kilometers, covering nearly all of North Africa. From the Atlantic to the Red Sea, it's the largest hot desert on Earth. A continent within a continent. Seen from above, it looks almost alien. Mountain ranges drowned in dunes. Dry riverbeds twisting like veins across a body that once pulsed with water. But here's the strange thing. For most of human history, it wasn't like this. The Sahara we know, the endless sun-baked expanse, might just be a passing phase, a brief dry chapter in a much longer, wetter story. If we could roll back time, not just centuries, but tens of thousands of years, we'd find that much of what's now sand was once savanna. Green plains dotted with lakes and rivers, home to giraffes, hippos, elephants, and early humans. The air would hum with insects, the soil soft beneath bare feet. It was alive, fertile, and thriving. Scientists call these intervals the African humid periods, times when the region's climate shifted dramatically, turning desert to grassland. The most recent one ended about 5,000 years ago, right around when ancient Egypt began to rise. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe not. The rhythm of the Sahara's transformations follows a cosmic pattern. Every 20,000 years or so, Earth's tilt and orbit change slightly, altering how sunlight warms the continents. When the northern hemisphere gets a bit more summer heat, the monsoon rains move northward. The Sahara blooms. When the cycle swings back, the rains retreat and the green gives way to gold again. This breath of the planet has been repeating for millions of years. Lush, dry, painting and erasing civilizations that might never have made it into recorded history. For archaeologists, that cycle is both a gift and a curse. The sands preserve things beautifully, but they also hide them deeply. Satellites have detected ancient river systems buried beneath the dunes, their courses still visible from space. There are traces of lake beds so vast they could have rivaled modern seas. Some researchers believe that within those lost basins, entire networks of human settlements might be entombed, waiting for rediscovery. It's as if the desert is holding its breath, keeping secrets until the right moment. For centuries, travelers and scientists alike have speculated that before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, maybe even before the Indus Valley, there existed a civilization here that was washed away, not by water, but by the absence of it. They point to ancient rock art, stone circles, and forgotten tools scattered across regions that now seem utterly uninhabitable. Each one suggests that people not only lived here, they thrived. Imagine standing in what's now the Central Sahara, near the Tilai Naja Plateau in southern Algeria. The land looks barren, all ochre, rock, and wind, but then you step into a sheltered canyon, and on the walls around you are paintings, thousands of them, herds of cattle, people dancing, swimming, hunting with bows and spears. The scenes are vivid, joyful, and utterly out of place in a desert that hasn't seen rain in millennia. They speak of rivers, of grasslands, of communities that once organized their days around water and migration. It's hard not to wonder who they were. Were they nomads who simply followed the green as the rains shifted? Or something more permanent, a settled people who built, traded, and shaped a culture that left faint traces for the wind to bury? Some evidence points toward the latter. Across Niger, Chad, Libya, and Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered pottery shards, stone tools, even remnants of dwellings. Not primitive campsites, but signs of coordinated living, storage pits, hearths, and organized layouts that suggest planning. In the far southwest of Egypt lies Nabta, one of the most intriguing places in the Sahara. To the untrained eye, it's just a dry lakebed scattered with stones. But in the late 20th century, archaeologists found that those stones weren't random. They'd been arranged, some in alignments that matched the solstices, others forming circles that might predate Stonehenge by 1,000 years. The site was active around 7,000 years ago, during a time when the Sahara was still green. People gathered there seasonally, probably to celebrate the rains and the cycles of the stars. It's here that the story of the Sahara begins to sound less like prehistory and more like a forgotten prologue to civilization itself. These weren't isolated foragers. They were astronomers, herders, engineers of ritual and memory. When the desert began to dry again, they may have moved east, following the Nile, bringing their knowledge of water, crops, and celestial timing with them. Some researchers even speculate that the rise of the Egyptian civilization was seeded by migrations out of the Sahara as it turned arid. The idea isn't proven, but it's compelling that the Sahara, far from being the cradle of emptiness, might have been the cradle before the cradle. Satellite imagery continues to add pieces to this puzzle. High-resolution scans reveal patterns under the sand that resemble river deltas and floodplains. Some show concentric shapes that could be geological, or perhaps the remains of ancient settlements. One region in Mauritania, the Risha structure, often called the Eye of the Sahara, has inspired endless debate. It's a massive circular formation, visible from space, made of concentric rings of rock. Geologists say it's a natural dome eroded over time, but its symmetry, size, and the presence of ancient artifacts in nearby areas have sparked speculation that it might have once been a hub of early human activity. Some even connected rather imaginatively to the legend of Atlantis. The science doesn't support that link, but the fascination tells us something. The desert invites wonder, partly because it hides more than it reveals. For scientists working in the Sahara, even reaching these sites can be a challenge. The terrain shifts constantly, dunes move like tides, and temperatures swing between extremes. But with ground-penetrating radar, remote sensing, and isotope analysis, we're starting to piece together what the landscape once looked like. Layers of fossilized pollen and sediment cores from ancient lakes show unmistakable evidence of grasses, trees, and water-loving species. It wasn't just habitable, it was abundant. That abundance changed the course of human evolution. Early Homo sapiens and even older hominins before them used these green corridors as migration routes. The Sahara wasn't always a barrier between North Africa and Sub-Sahara and Africa, it was a bridge. Genetic studies suggest that during the wet periods, populations mixed across vast distances, spreading technologies, languages, and ideas. When the desert returned, those groups became isolated again, preserving fragments of their once shared cultures. It's like a heartbeat in slow motion. Connection, separation, over tens of thousands of years. If you look at the Sahara today, it can feel impossible to imagine life thriving there. Yet every grain of sand is part of that memory. The wind still uncovers fossilized fish, petrified wood, and even the footprints of ancient animals that once crossed muddy plains. It's as if the desert occasionally exhales, revealing what it's been holding on to. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: the Sahara might not always stay dry. The same orbital cycles that turned it green before will one day do so again. It may take thousands of years, but eventually rains will return, rivers will carve through dunes once more, lakes will reappear, and life will follow. If humanity is still around, we may witness the desert's rebirth, a second chance for a landscape that has seen civilizations come and go like waves against its timeless shore. Until then, it keeps its secrets. The lost rivers still trace their paths under the sand. The rock paintings still wait in the shade of forgotten cliffs. The stories of people who lived and dreamed there remain half buried, half whispered by the wind. The desert remembers, and as we drift deeper into its memory, the next part of our journey will take us further back to a time when the Sahara was not a desert at all, but a garden of life. A place where Earth itself seemed younger, where rivers flowed, where now only sand moves, and where the first signs of human imagination began to take root beneath a sky full of rain. When we imagine the Sahara, we often see heat rising from the sand in shimmering waves, an endless stretch of dunes under a sky so bright it feels almost metallic. But long before it was a desert, before the sun baked its surface into silence, the Sahara was green. Not just a patch or two of grass near an oasis, but an enormous, thriving ecosystem stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. A place alive with rivers, trees, and lakes large enough to dwarf the ones we know today. To picture it properly, you have to unlearn the desert a little. Forget the dryness, the glare, the mirage. Instead, think of wide plains covered in tall grasses and scattered acacia trees, herds of antelope grazing in the shade, elephants lumbering through shallow pools, crocodiles slipping into water thick with reeds. There were thunderstorms in the afternoons, monsoon rains that turned the ground dark and fragrant. The air would have been heavy with a smell of damp earth. And above it all, the same constellations we see now, mirrored in the reflections of lakes that have since disappeared into dust. This world, lush and restless, came and went many times. The Sahara's greening wasn't a one-time event. It followed the slow rhythm of Earth's orbit, a cosmic metronome keeping time with the tilt of the planet. About every 20-30 years, the tilt shifts just enough to change where the rains fall. During those intervals, the monsoon winds push farther north, carrying moisture deep into what's now desert. Grasslands spread, rivers reawaken. The Sahara breathes in. Then, as the tilt swings back, the monsoons retreat, the rains fade, and the Sahara exhales. The grass dies, the lakes dry up, and dunes crawl back over the bones of rivers. This cycle has played out over and over for millions of years. During the last green age, roughly between 14,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was at its most hospitable. Fossil evidence tells the story. Beneath the sand, researchers have found the remains of fish, hippos, and crocodiles, animals that couldn't survive in a desert. Fossilized pollen trapped in ancient sediments tells us what grew there. Grasses, shrubs, and even trees that still thrive farther south today. It wasn't just a few patches of greenery. It was an entire landscape transformed. If you could stand there then, maybe near what's now the heart of Libya or Chad, you'd see lakes spreading out to the horizon. Some, like the ancient Megachad, were enormous, larger than the Caspian Sea. It's hard to imagine such scale in a place now so dry, but the evidence is clear. The outlines of those vanished lakes are still visible from satellites, faint scars of shorelines that loop across the desert like ghost coastlines. In their basins you can still find shells of freshwater snails, the remains of fish bones, and even footprints fossilized in once wet mud. The animals that lived there tell their own story. Fossil records and ancient rock carvings show elephants, giraffes, buffalo, and even lions. There were turtles, crocodiles, and herds of cattle. These creatures weren't visitors. They belonged there. They grazed, hunted, and nested in the Sahara's rivers and grasslands, part of an ecosystem that had found balance in what we now call an extreme environment. It's a reminder that climate is not static. The world we know is only one version of Earth, caught between cycles of warmth, water, and wind. And where there were animals, there were people. Archaeologists have uncovered tools and artifacts scattered across the region, some tens of thousands of years old. Stone blades, scrapers, and pottery fragments speak of humans who hunted, fished, and gathered here long before the sands arrived. They lived along the shores of those vanished lakes, moving with the seasons, building temporary camps that may have lasted generations. Their world was full of color. Green plains, dark waters, gray storms, red sunsets. They painted it on rock walls and carved it into memory. In Algeria's Tassili Naja Mountains, the rock art is so abundant, it's almost overwhelming. There are scenes of swimming figures, people with bows and arrows, women carrying pots, and animals that couldn't survive a single day in the Sahara. Now, the pigments have faded, but the meaning remains. These people weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had time to observe, to depict, to remember. Their art tells us that they didn't see the Sahara as harsh or temporary. It was home. Some of those images show cattle herding, a detail that's more profound than it might seem. Domestic cattle imply a structured way of life. Hearing requires planning, knowing where water will be, when the grass will grow, and how to move with the seasons. It means cooperation and shared knowledge, the kind that forms the backbone of community. This wasn't just a scattering of hunters, it was an organized society shaped by the land and its rhythms. When scientists began dating the artifacts from these Green Sahara periods, they noticed something remarkable. The timing of its drying coincides closely with the rise of complex societies along the Nile. As the desert began to lose its water, the people who once lived among its lakes and plains may have migrated toward the river that never stopped flowing. The Nile became a refuge, and perhaps also a new beginning. Those who had learned to track the rains and manage herds brought their skills with them, laying the foundations for agriculture, settlement, and eventually civilization. That connection between climate change and human development is one of the Sahara's great lessons. When the environment shifted, people adapted, not by giving up, but by moving, learning, and transforming their way of life. The drying of the Sahara wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a catalyst, one that might have shaped the course of history. Without it, Egypt as we know it might never have emerged. But even during its greenest times, the Sahara wasn't uniform. It wasn't one vast lawn of grass stretching unbroken across Africa. There were regions of dense vegetation, others of open savanna, and still others that stayed semi-arid. The rain came in bands, heavier in some years, lighter in others. Lakes expanded and shrank. Rivers wandered. To live there required flexibility and deep knowledge of the land. The people who thrived there understood how to read the sky, follow the animals, and find water even as the season shifted. The lakes themselves were worlds within worlds. Some were shallow and temporary, forming only during the wettest years. Others lasted millennia. Sediment cores from these basins show layers of clay, silt, and organic matter built up over thousands of years. Each layer is a page in the Sahara's diary, a record of when the rains came, what plants grew, and how life pulsed through the region. Scientists can even trace tiny particles of pollen carried by the wind from distant forests, revealing how far the green reached during the wettest periods. One of the most striking findings from these cores is the presence of algae and datums, microscopic organisms that only live in fresh water. Their remains are like timestamps confirming that lakes once covered vast stretches of what is now sand. Some of those lakes lasted so long that they developed their own ecosystems, complete with species that existed nowhere else on Earth. When the water finally vanished, so did they. The desert, in a way, is built upon their fossils. To stand in those dry basins today is to feel the weight of transformation. The surface is cracked and pale, the horizon blurred by heat. Yet just a few meters below, the soil still contains traces of moisture. In some areas, the groundwater that once fed those ancient lakes remains trapped in aquifers. Is what modern oases depend on, a buried inheritance from the Green Sahara. Every palm grove that rises from the desert today is a faint echo of that lush past. The story of the Sahara's greening also stretches beyond Africa. Similar cycles occurred in Arabia, in the Sahara Desert of India, even in parts of Australia. These global patterns remind us that Earth's climate is interconnected, shaped by orbital wobbles and solar rhythms far beyond our control. When one desert blooms, another might fade. When one river dries, a new one forms elsewhere. The planet is constantly balancing itself, trading water, wind, and warmth between its regions like breaths. Understanding these shifts helps scientists predict what might come next. If the Sahara has turned green before, Could it do so again? The answer is yes, at least in theory. The same orbital cycles that caused the last humid period will eventually return over the next 10,000 years. As Earth's tilt and orbit continue to shift, the Sahara could once again transform into grassland. In fact, early signs of this change can already be observed in small ways. Some models suggest that with enough rainfall and vegetation, the desert could flip rapidly into a wetter state. It's a reminder that even the largest landscapes can change faster than we expect. But the human factor complicates that natural rhythm. Greenhouse gas emissions and global warming may alter the cycles or override them entirely. If rainfall patterns shift differently because of human influence, the Sahara's future could diverge from its past. It's a sobering thought that a pattern written in the sky for millions of years could be disrupted by what happens here on the ground. Still, the idea of a green Sahara remains captivating. It challenges the way we think about deserts, not as dead zones but as places of transformation. The sand hides not only fossils and artifacts, but memory. It reminds us that even the harshest places were once full of life, and might be again. For ancient humans, the greening of the Sahara must have felt like a miracle. Imagine being part of a lineage that had known only arid landscapes, suddenly finding rivers that flowed year after year, herds of animals to hunt, and soil that could grow plants. It would have seemed like the world itself had turned generous. They built their lives around that generosity, trusting it would last. When it began to fade, they must have watched with confusion as the lakes shrank and the rains grew fickle. Slowly their home turned back into sand. Yet even in its drying, the Sahara offered lessons. Those who lived through the change carried their stories with them. They painted their memories on stone, left tools behind in the layers of silt, and passed down oral traditions that spoke of times when the desert was green. Some of those myths survived thousands of years later in cultures far from the Sahara. Tales of lost paradises and vanished rivers. The desert remembers because people made it remember. Every artifact unearthed, every carving revealed is a fragment of that memory surfacing again. When scientists kneel in the sand and brush away grains to reveal a shard of pottery or a fossilized fish, they're not just finding evidence. They're reopening a conversation that's been silent for millennia. The next time you see an image of the Sahara from space, try to imagine it not as a sea of sand, but as a vast mosaic of green. Picture the ghost outlines of lakes, the shadows of rivers, the footprints of elephants, and the small human campsites that once hugged the water's edge. Beneath those dunes, somewhere might still lie the remains of villages' tools, and maybe even burial sites that predate the pyramids. The past isn't gone, it's sleeping. And as we continue tracing this ancient world, the next step in our journey leads us deeper underground into the forgotten arteries of the Sahara. The lost rivers that once connected its heart to the sea. They are still there, silent and unseen, but their courses tell a story that could reshape everything we think we know about where civilization began. Beneath the dunes of the Sahara, hidden under kilometers of sand, lie the ghost paths of rivers that once crossed an entirely different world. They are not visible to the eye now, but from space, the traces remain like faint scars across a sleeping face. Ancient riverbeds, long, dry, meander through the subsurface layers of the desert, some stretching for hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. Their shapes are unmistakable. The branching deltas, the sinuous bends, the wide floodplains that once carried water and life. If we could peel back the sand like a thin veil, we would find the arteries of a land that once pulsed with movement, connecting lakes, forests, and people. The story of these rivers began long before recorded time, in an era when climate and geography were partners in creating vast networks of flowing water. Geologists studying the Sahara's subsurface through radar imaging, satellite observation, and sediment analysis have discovered at least half a dozen major river systems buried beneath the sand. Among them are the Tamarade River, the Kufra River, the Ha-Ha, and others whose courses once cut from deep inland Africa all the way to the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. They are not myths, not guesses, but real channels preserved like fossils in stone and dust. The Samon-Russet River is perhaps the most astonishing of them all. Its traces were first detected through radar data collected by satellites in the early 2000s. When scientists processed the images, what appeared were the unmistakable outlines of a colossal river valley, a channel stretching from the Hoga Mountains in southern Algeria, across the heart of the Sahara and down to the coast of Mauritania, where it emptied into what is now the Atlantic Ocean. If it flowed today, it would rival the Niger or even the Nile. Its basin covered over 1 million square kilometers, and during wet periods, it might have carried as much water as the Mississippi. The river's discovery changed how scientists viewed the Sahara. It meant that not only was the desert once green, but it also had a vast and intricate hydrological network. This wasn't a patchwork of isolated lakes, but a connected system of life where fish, crocodiles and early humans could have traveled for hundreds of kilometers along water routes. It stitched the landscape together, making migration, trade and communication possible long before cities or written records. Imagining those rivers flowing again is like seeing an alternate version of Earth, one that existed in the same space as ours, but in another time. The banks of the Tamerset would have been lush with vegetation, home to reeds and papyrus, fig trees and willows. Herds of gazelle and antelope would have come to drink in the evenings, their hooves pressing into the soft mud, and where animals gathered, people followed. Archaeological sites near the Tamerset's ancient basin contain stone tools and artifacts dated to around 10,000 years ago. They belong to cultures that flourished during the last African humid period, when the Sahara's rains returned after the last ice age. These tools are not primitive leftovers. They're carefully crafted points, scrapers and blades that reveal intelligence and precision. Whoever made them was skilled not just at surviving, but at thriving in a landscape that provided everything they needed. Further east, beneath the sands of Libya and Egypt, lies the trace of another forgotten river system, known as the Kufra River. Satellite radar mapping has revealed channels and deltas buried beneath the dunes of the eastern Sahara, showing that this river once flowed north toward the Mediterranean. It connected a series of ancient basins that now form the Kufra and Tibesti regions. In its time, it would have been a highway of fertility, feeding large wetlands where animals grazed and humans settled seasonally. The remains of fossilized riverbanks still contain deposits of clays and silts, unmistakable signs of long-standing water. Some of these buried channels have even been linked to underground aquifers that still store water from those ancient rivers. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, for example, which stretches beneath Egypt, Libya, Chad and Sudan, is one of the largest reserves of fossil water in the world. It's the trapped memory of those vanished rivers, a hidden sea locked beneath the desert floor. Wells drilled into it bring up water that fell as rain thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every drop that surfaces is, in a sense, a message from a greener Earth. This buried network tells us that the Sahara wasn't an isolated desert, but once part of a vast connected world. Rivers link the interior of Africa to the coasts, creating corridors of life that may have guided early human migration. When Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa roughly 100,000 years ago, these rivers might have served as routes northward. Rather than crossing endless dunes, our ancestors may have walked along flowing water, resting in the shade, following the sound of birds and frogs, the sounds of home. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence for these ancient waterways comes not from the surface, but from space. Using satellite radar systems like NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, scientists have been able to see through the thin upper layer of sand to detect buried geological structures. The radar waves bounce differently off compact rock, moist sediment or dry dunes, revealing ghostly outlines that can't be seen by the naked eye. It's like holding up an X-ray to the planet and watching its bones appear. These images have exposed vast branching networks, old river deltas, braided channels and floodplains long gone from the surface. Among them are the unmistakable traces of lakes once fed by these rivers. The most famous of these ancient bodies of water is Lake Chad, which once occupied much of what is now Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. At its greatest extent, it covered nearly 400,000 square km, an inland sea larger than all the Great Lakes of North America combined. Its shores would have been lined with fishes and herders, its waters filled with hippos and crocodiles. When it eventually dried up, it left behind the much smaller Lake Chad we know today, a fraction of its former self. But its sediments still contain evidence of the creatures that once lived there, as well as traces of human occupation, hearths, pottery, and tools buried in layers of silt. The existence of such lakes and rivers doesn't just tell us about the Sahara's past, it also provides clues about its role in human history. For decades, archaeologists assumed that the earliest centers of civilization developed independently along great rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, and Euphrates, the Indus. But the buried rivers of the Sahara challenge that assumption. If there were once extensive river systems running through North Africa, then it's possible that human communities in these regions developed complex cultures earlier than we've recognized. The evidence of structured settlements, astronomical knowledge, and animal domestication at places like Napa supports that idea. Civilization might not have sprung fully formed from the Nile Valley. It may have drifted there on the last tides of the Sahara's rivers. And yet, the sands remain mostly unexplored. Political instability, extreme conditions, and the sheer vastness of the region make archaeological work difficult. Much of what we know comes from remote sensing rather than excavation. Scientists can map the outlines of these buried systems, but actually reaching them, uncovering their artifacts, their fossils, their remnants of habitation, is still rare. Every expedition risks being swallowed by the desert's heat or buried by shifting dunes before the day's end. Despite that, the search continues. Teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and drones are mapping new sections of these hidden rivers each year. They found that even in areas once considered lifeless, traces of ancient habitation persist. Hearths, grinding stones, fragments of pottery embedded in dry riverbeds. These are the fingerprints of a people who lived by the water's edge long after it began to fade. What's striking is how recently some of these rivers might have flowed. Sediment analysis suggests that water was present in parts of the Central Sahara as recently as 5,000 years ago, a blink of an eye in geological terms. Some valleys still channel seasonal runoff during rare rainstorms, their dry beds briefly transformed into torrents before evaporating again. To stand in one of these wadis during a sudden rain is to glimpse for a moment the ancient Sahara reawakening. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The idea that beneath one of the driest places on Earth lies evidence of water everywhere. The Sahara, for all its silence, is not dead. It's sleeping layered with memory. Its sands are like pages of a book written over and over by climate, by wind, by time. Each dune might have been a riverbank once, each grain of sand, a fragment of stone, washed smooth by water that hasn't flowed for 10,000 years. In the central and northern Sahara, traces of smaller tributaries connect to the larger buried rivers. These once fed into basins that supported communities of early humans and animals. The patterns are so consistent that scientists can reconstruct entire hydrological networks from them. When they overlay these maps with archaeological findings, a picture emerges. Clusters of human sites lining the same paths where rivers once ran. It's a powerful convergence of evidence. People lived by the water, followed it when it moved, and left behind their stories in tools and carvings that now rest beneath sand. Some researchers believe that these rivers also played a role in shaping weather patterns. When the Sahara was green, its moisture and vegetation would have created regional climates that encouraged further rainfall, a feedback loop of life. The rivers fed the air fed the rain, and the cycle sustained itself for millennia. Once that balance tipped and the rivers dried, the process reversed. Dust replaced moisture, reflecting sunlight, cooling the surface and pushing the monsoon southward. The desert expanded, and with it the memory of rivers faded into myth. But the traces are still there, more than geological curiosities. In the stories of local peoples, in fragments of ancient folklore, echoes of those rivers survive. Nomadic tribes who roam the Sahara today sometimes speak of ancestral lands where grass grew high and lakes stretched as far as the eye could see. In Tuareg and Berber oral histories, there are references to old valleys, wells, and springs that have long vanished. These aren't legends in the abstract sense. They're oral maps of a world that once existed. Passed down generation after generation, they preserve the memory of flowing water in a land that has forgotten it. When scientists compare those stories with satellite data, the alignments are astonishing. The places described in legend often match real buried river systems, as if memory has lasted where water could not. It's one of the most haunting reminders that history isn't only written in books or carved in stone. Sometimes it's whispered in the stories people tell when they gather around a fire at night under the same stars that once reflected in ancient streams. In recent years, the exploration of these hidden rivers has gained new urgency. As climate change accelerates, understanding the Sahara's past may help us predict its future. If the desert has turned green before, perhaps it could again. Some scientists even propose that with the right environmental management, reforestation, controlled irrigation, and restoration projects, small parts of the Sahara could one day bloom artificially, echoing its ancient cycles. The idea might sound ambitious, but it's rooted in the same evidence that first revealed the Tamreate. Beneath the sand, water still lingers. In a way, the Sahara's lost rivers are more than geological features. They're reminders of impermanence. The planet changes often beyond what we can imagine, yet traces of its former selves remain, waiting to be seen again. The rivers may no longer flow, but they left behind maps of possibility. Proof that even the harshest landscapes can be reborn. If the desert hides the story of water, then it also hides the story of a life's persistence. Every dry channel once carried movement, trade, and migration. Every basin once held not just water, but human dreams, tools, rituals, and songs. The rivers may have vanished, but the civilizations they nourished might still lie waiting beneath their beds. And so, as the wind continues to sweep across the dunes, sculpting them into waves and ridges, the memory of those ancient rivers hums quietly beneath the surface. If we listen closely to the sand, the wind, the data, we might still hear the faint echo of flowing water. Ahead lies another question. If rivers once cradled life across the Sahara, where are the traces of those who followed them? What footprints remain of the people who lived by their banks, fished their depths, and crossed their waters long before the desert arrived? Somewhere beneath the sand, their world is still there, waiting to be uncovered grain by grain. When the winds die down across the Sahara, sometimes the sand gives up a secret. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, as if the desert itself exhales. What emerges might be a shard of pottery, a fragment of bone, or a series of indentations shaped like footprints pressed into hardened mud thousands of years ago. They don't look like much at first, a few depressions in the dust scattered across a barren landscape. But to archaeologists, these small marks are more than curiosities. They are proof of presence. The traces of lives once lived along the forgotten shores of the Sahara's vanished lakes. Footprints are fragile things. They only survive when the conditions are perfect, when wet ground dries quickly, when wind covers them with fine dust before erosion wipes them away. In most places they disappear within days, but in the Sahara, time behaves differently. The same dryness that makes the desert harsh also makes it protective. Without water to wash them away, ancient imprints can endure, suspended between erosion and preservation. In recent decades, scientists have found footprints scattered across what used to be riverbanks and lakebeds, silent evidence that people once walked there when the Sahara was not sand, but soil. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in what's now northern Niger, near the site of Goro. To the untrained eye, Gobero is just another patch of desolation, flat, wind-blown, utterly lifeless. But beneath the surface, it hides an ancient lake shore that was once alive with human activity. Around 10,000 years ago, the region held a freshwater lake surrounded by grasslands and trees. People camped along its edges, hunted nearby, and buried their dead in shallow graves overlooking the water. When the lake finally dried up, it sealed their world beneath layers of sand, preserving it with almost impossible tenderness. Archaeologists uncovered dozens of burials there, along with pottery, stone tools, and the fossilized remains of fish and crocodiles. The skeletons told a story not of hardship, but of community. Some were found in groups, carefully arranged as if placed with intention. One of the most famous burials is that of a woman and 2 children, their bodies positioned together, their hands almost touching. Pollen grains found in the sediment suggested that flowers had been laid with them. Even after 10,000 years, the gesture feels human in the most familiar sense. Love expressed in the face of loss. The people of Goro belong to 2 distinct cultures separated by centuries. The first, known as the Kifian, lived there when the Sahara was lush and the lake full. They were tall, strong hunter fishes who relied on the rich waters around them. When the climate dried for a few thousand years, the lake disappeared, and so did the Kifian. Later, when rains returned, a second group arrived, the Tenarians. They were smaller, more delicate, perhaps pastoralists, who herded cattle and goats. Their presence shows how the Sahara's rhythm shaped not just the landscape, but entire societies. The same spot could host life, lose it, and then host it again, like a door opening and closing with each changing climate. Go isn't the only place where ancient footprints and shorelines have resurfaced. Across the desert, from Mauritania to Sudan, faint traces of human movement emerge from time to time. Stone circles marking campsites, hearths still blackened with charcoal, fishing tools lying where they were dropped. In southern Libya, near the Tadratus Mountains, archaeologists have found similar remains, pottery, animal bones, and carvings that suggest a complex relationship with the environment. People didn't just pass through, they lived here, adapted, and flourished. Each discovery challenges the stereotype of the Sahara as a place of emptiness. The truth is that it has been a crossroads for as long as there have been humans to cross it. The ancient lakes that once dotted its surface served as magnets for life, drawing in animals and people from across the continent. Shorelines, after all, are where stories converge. They're places of arrival and departure, of sustenance and exchange. Along the edges of those vanished waters, people hunted, fished, traded, and told stories about the rains that came and went. One of the key ways scientists trace those ancient shorelines is through satellite imagery. From space, the Sahara's surface holds subtle clues invisible from the ground. Long, curving ridges of sediment mark where waves once lapped. The patterns of salt flats or sebkes trace the outlines of evaporated lakes. In the eastern Sahara, near the border of Chad and Sudan, the Wadi Hawa stands out as a great dry river valley that once connected the central Sahara to the Nile. It's thought to have been a corridor of life linking ecosystems and human populations for thousands of years. Archaeological surveys along the Wadi have found stone tools, animal bones, and hearths dating back to the last humid period. When the river finally dried up, it cut off the Sahara from the Nile, isolating communities and changing the course of human movement across Africa. That isolation may explain one of the most intriguing puzzles in prehistory: why civilizations seem to arise independently in different parts of the world around the same time. If the Sahara once supported early cultures that were later scattered by drought, those people might have carried fragments of their knowledge outward to the Nile, to the Sahel, to the Mediterranean. In that sense, the Sahara's drying didn't erase history. It redistributed it. Its people became the seeds of new beginnings elsewhere. But before they left behind traces of a rich existence. The archaeological record is full of small personal artifacts that speak volumes. Beads made from shells carried hundreds of kilometers from the sea, suggesting trade or long distance travel. Grinding stones used to prepare grains and roots. Bone harpoons carved with geometric patterns. These objects aren't just functional. They show creativity and communication, hints of ritual and identity. Some of the pottery found along ancient Sahara and lake shores is decorated with wavy lines, possibly imitations of water. Even in art, they were remembering the thing that sustained them. In places like the Pheasant Basin in Libya, ancient lake deposits have yielded layers of silt containing pollen and plant remains. Among them are species that today only grow far to the south. Their presence proves that the Sahara's past vegetation stretched across what is now one of the driest regions on Earth. It also hints at how far human populations could travel, following familiar ecosystems as they expanded northward during the green periods. Wherever the plants went, the animals followed. Wherever the animals went, the people went. The discovery of fossilized footprints, particularly those of humans and animals walking side by side, adds an emotional layer to these reconstructions. They're moments frozen in time. Someone crossing a lake shore, perhaps at dawn, the mud firm underfoot, unaware that their step would outlast civilizations. In one site in Chad, hundreds of fossilized animal tracks crisscross an ancient floodplain, evidence of a thriving habitat. Among them, the faint impressions of human feet suggest that people were part of that landscape, moving through it as naturally as the herds they followed. These ancient paths also challenge our assumptions about how early humans saw their world. It's easy to think of prehistory as a time of constant struggle, of small groups surviving on the edge of scarcity. But the Sahara's green periods tell a different story, one of abundance, of movement, of deep familiarity with the land. These people were explorers, scientists, and artists in their own way. They understood the stars well enough to track seasons, the plants well enough to find medicine, and the sky well enough to predict the coming of rain. Their knowledge wasn't written down, but it was no less precise. Sometimes their legacy is preserved not in artifacts, but in the land itself. The shapes of dunes and dry valleys follow the contours of the lakes that came before. In the low light of sunrise or sunset, you can still see the outlines of ancient shorelines stretching for miles. They are subtle, like memories half faded, but they're there. And in those shapes, you can read the story of a world that once thrived. Scientists studying isotopes in fossilized shells and bones can even reconstruct the chemistry of the water that filled those lakes. The ratios of oxygen isotopes reveal changes in temperature and rainfall, helping to map the Sahara's climatic history in remarkable detail. It's like decoding a diary written by minerals instead of ink. The results show fluctuations in water levels that correspond closely to known periods of global climate change. When glaciers advanced in the north, the Sahara dried. When they retreated, it bloomed. The fates of ice and sand were linked across continents. There's also evidence that the people who lived along these ancient lakes weren't isolated tribes, but part of a broad network. Similar tools, pottery styles, and burial practices appear across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. This suggests that even without cities or writing, communication and exchange flourished. The Sahara's rivers and lakes acted as natural highways, bringing people together across vast distances. In that sense, the Sahara wasn't just a place of early habitation. It was an early stage for human connection. Every discovery reinforces the same quiet truth. The desert we see today is only one moment in a much longer story. Beneath its dunes lies layer upon layer of human experience, each one covered, forgotten, and waiting. The footprints and shorelines, the graves and tools, they all whisper the same thing, that this was once a place of life, not absence. And still, even as we uncover more of these ancient worlds, the question remains, what happened when the rain stopped for good? When the lakes receded and the grasses turned to dust, how did those people endure? Did they fight to stay, clinging to shrinking oases, or did they follow the water's retreat, carrying their knowledge with them into new lands? The clues suggest both. Some adapted, shifting toward pastoralism, herring animals that could travel long distances. Others moved toward permanent sources of water, the Nile, the Niger, the highlands where rainfall still fell. Each group left a trail, faint but traceable. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these discoveries is how familiar the story feels. A changing climate, a vanishing resource, a migration born of necessity. It's a cycle as old as humanity, and one that continues in different forms even today. The Sahara's ancient people faced it with resilience and ingenuity, leaving behind a record of adaptation written not in words, but in movement. Every footprint in the sand, every carved stone, Every ancient shore now buried beneath dunes speaks of a time when life and water intertwined across what we now call desert. The sands that cover them are not erasure but preservation. The desert may look empty, but it's filled with memory. And somewhere within that memory, if we listen carefully enough, lies the beginning of the human story as we know it. And just beyond those vanished lakes and riverbanks, scattered among the rocky plateaus and windswept valleys, are signs of something even more deliberate. Not just footprints or graves, but markings made to endure. Figures carved in stone, paintings that speak of animals, rituals, and perhaps belief itself. The next layer of the Sahara story waits in those carvings. The art of people who saw the world not as barren but alive. Long before stone rose into the shape of pyramids, before the Nile had its temples and the pharaohs had their names, there were people who lived in the wide green reaches of what is now the Sahara. They were not yet kings or builders of monuments, but they were already shaping the world in ways that would echo into history. Their homes stood beside rivers that no longer flow, their herds grazed in valleys now covered by dunes, and their rituals unfolded beneath skies that once carried heavy, generous rain. When we look far enough back before the dynasties and the writing and the great cities, we find them there. Quiet, resourceful, deeply observant people who thrived in the rhythm of a land that has since fallen silent. To understand who they were, we have to start with what the land gave them. In the period between about 10 and 6,000 years ago, much of the Sahara was lush. Rainfall patterns driven by Earth's shifting orbit created lakes and rivers that lasted for centuries. Where water lingered, communities formed. The people of this era were hunters, fishers, and herders. But their lives were far from primitive. They were skilled at shaping stone, at decorating pottery, and at navigating the changing seasons. They had time for art, for ceremony, and for memory. Archaeological evidence of these early Saharan cultures is scattered but consistent. Across modern-day Algeria, Libya, Niger, Chad, and Egypt, tools and artifacts tell a story of steady innovation. The same landscape that today seems uniform and empty once supported a network of distinct but related groups. Some were nomadic, moving with the rains and the herds. Others built semi-permanent settlements near lakes or along the banks of ancient rivers. Together they formed a kind of invisible civilization, one without written records or great monuments, but with a shared understanding of how to live with a landscape that shifted beneath them. One of the earliest and most studied of these cultures is the Capsian. Named after the city of Gafsa in Tunisia, where their tools were first identified, the Capsians lived more than 8,000 years ago, long before the Egyptian dynasties rose. Their sites are found not only in North Africa, but extending into regions that would later become part of the Sahara's desolation. They used finely crafted stone blades, microliths, and scrapers. They made beads from shells carried from the coast, showing trade or at least long-distance travel. And in their burial sites, they left personal ornaments and ochre-stained remains, signs of ritual and belief, a recognition of identity that transcended mere survival. As the Green Sahara expanded, these groups evolved. They learned to domesticate animals, particularly cattle. Herring became a cornerstone of life in the Central Sahara. Rock art from the Tassili Najjar and the Ennery Plateau shows countless scenes of cattle herds often tended by people who appear to be guiding them with familiarity and care. These images are not random. They record the importance of cattle not just as food, but as symbols of prosperity, of social standing, and perhaps even spirituality. In many African cultures today, cattle still holds sacred significance. It's possible that this reverence began here, in the grasslands that preceded the desert. This pastoral shift marks one of humanity's great transitions from dependence on the hunt to mastery of domestic life. The people before the pyramids were part of that transformation. They began shaping landscapes intentionally, choosing where to settle based on grazing routes and water access. Archaeologists studying the ancient site of Nabta Plier in southern Egypt have uncovered evidence of this kind of organization. What looks at first like a scattering of stones reveals itself under careful study as a planned arrangement. circular structures, alignments pointing towards solstices, and the remains of hearths and animal pens. Nabta Playa sits today in a desolate stretch of desert, but 7,000 years ago it was a seasonal lake, a gathering place. People came here to water their herds and perhaps to observe the sky. Some of the stone alignments appear to mark celestial events, suggesting that these early herders were already tracking the movement of the sun and stars. That ability to measure time, to predict the seasons, would later become one of the foundations of civilization. Agriculture, construction, religion all depend on knowing when the world will change. It seems that understanding began not in the temples of Egypt, but in the open air of the Sahara. The people who built and used Nabta Playa were not isolated dreamers. They were part of a continuum stretching across the desert, connected by trade, migration, and shared experience. Similar sites have been found across North Africa, though none as extensively studied. Together, they form a mosaic of early human achievement. These were the people who learned to work with nature rather than against it, to anticipate rather than react. When the rains began to falter, they adapted again, moving toward more permanent sources of water, clustering around oases and eventually following the shrinking rivers eastward toward the Nile. This movement may explain one of the great mysteries of early Egyptian history: how a civilization so advanced appeared so rapidly. When the first organized communities arose along the Nile around 5,000 years ago, they already possessed a deep understanding of cattle hearing, irrigation, astronomy, and ritual. These skills didn't emerge from nothing. They were inherited, refined, and carried from places like Nablus and the Green Sahara. In a sense, Egypt was the heir to a forgotten world. The people who crossed the desert as it dried brought with them the seeds of civilization, literal seeds perhaps, and cultural ones too. The evidence for this connection continues to grow. Genetic studies show continuity between populations of the Central Sahara and those of early Nile Valley societies. Similarities in pottery styles, burial customs, and symbolic art point to shared origins. Even the earliest Egyptian religious imagery, sun worship, cattle symbolism, and the alignment of monuments with celestial bodies echoes practices that can be traced to the Sahara's prehistoric past. It's as if the desert, before it turned to sand, rehearsed the ideas that would later build pyramids. The transition from green to arid was gradual, but relentless. Around 5,500 years ago, the climate began to shift. The monsoon rains weakened, and the Great Lakes of the Sahara started to shrink. Grasslands gave way to scrub, then to dust. For generations, the people adapted, digging wells, storing water, traveling farther between pastures. But eventually, even resilience has limits. The drying intensified, forcing large-scale migrations. Those who had once followed rivers that are now buried beneath the dunes began following a different kind of river, the Nile, which still flowed reliably through its narrow valley. This migration didn't happen overnight. It took centuries, but as people gathered along the Nile, their knowledge pooled as well. Techniques for managing herds turned into methods for managing crops. Seasonal camps evolved into permanent settlements. Observations of the sun and stars used to track rainfall became calendars to organize planting and harvest. And the rituals once performed under the open desert sky found new homes in the temples that rose beside the river. The people before the pyramids were not merely the ancestors of Egypt. They were the bridge between prehistory and history itself. Their world straddled two eras, one wild and fluid, one structured and monumental. When the desert closed behind them, it sealed their memory away. The stories of the Nile took over, written in hieroglyphs and stone, while the voices of the Sahara faded into dust. Yet the continuity remains. The same intelligence that measured the solstice at Nabta Playa would one day align the Great Pyramid with true north. The same reverence for cattle that filled the rock art of Tassili Naja would echo in the sacred bull cults of ancient Egypt. The same understanding of cycles of life and death and renewal would appear again in the myths of the sun god Ra. Archaeologists who study these early Saharan cultures often speak with a kind of quiet awe. The artifacts are humble, Stone tools, bone ornaments, bits of pottery, but the implications are vast. They reveal a level of coordination, of planning, of abstract thought that belongs to people who saw themselves as part of something larger. Their world may have lacked written language, but it had its own grammar. The rhythm of seasons, the geometry of stars, the patterns of migration and return. In the rock shelters of the Arcus Mountains in southern Libya, hundreds of paintings depict scenes of daily life. People herd cattle, milk them, dance and gather around fires. The details are strikingly human. Figures leading calves, children reaching toward adults, groups celebrating under trees. Some images even show what appear to be musical instruments, drums or rattles. This was not a world of bare survival. It was a world with culture, with ceremony, with moments of joy. Every one of those paintings was made by someone who understood the land intimately. They knew where the grass grew after rain, where the rivers lingered longest, where to find shelter from the wind. When the environment began to change, they must have noticed it long before catastrophe arrived. A few years of poor rains, a lake that took longer to refill, a river that shrank from its banks. Slowly, the pattern shifted. And as it did, they moved, first a little, then farther, always searching for balance between water and dry ground. Their migration was not just physical, it was cultural, a diffusion of ideas that spread across regions and endured long after the land changed. The Sahara's people left no pyramids, but they left blueprints, the foundations of measurement, planning, and spiritual understanding that would later define the civilizations of North Africa and beyond. When archaeologists trace the origins of early settlement along the Nile, they find echoes of the desert in everything from tool designs to burial orientations. Even the earliest Egyptian words for sand, desert, and west carry connotations of ancestry, as if the people who wrote them remembered where they came from. Modern technology has made it possible to revisit this forgotten chapter in unprecedented detail. Satellite imagery, radio-carbon dating, and DNA analysis are all helping to fill the gaps. Each new discovery adds another thread to the tapestry, showing how deeply the Sahara was woven into the human story. But there's still far more hidden than revealed. Vast areas remain unexplored, inaccessible due to geography or politics. Beneath those dunes, entire sites may lie undisturbed. Villages, burial grounds, and artifacts untouched since the day their inhabitants left. For now we piece together their world through fragments. A carved bead here, a half there, a cluster of bones half buried in clay. Each find is like a single note from a melody that once filled the air. When enough notes are gathered, the song begins to take shape. It's a song about adaptation, creativity, and the bond between people and their environment. It tells us that long before pyramids cast shadows over the Nile, humans had already learned to measure their lives by cycles greater than themselves. As the desert wind moves over the dunes today, it whispers through the same valleys those early herders once crossed. It smooths the sand over ancient paths, concealing them again until chance or science reveals them. Somewhere beneath that surface lie the remains of the people who once looked at the stars and saw patterns worth following. They may never have built monuments, but in understanding the world around them, they built something just as lasting, the framework of civilization itself. And as we move deeper into their story, we begin to see not just who they were, but how they saw their world. The next layer of the Sahara's memory lies etched into stone in carvings and paintings that speak of rain, of life, and of the imagination that turned landscape into meaning. Those markings are still there in caves and on cliffs, quietly waiting for eyes that can still read them. Across the Sahara, on cliffs and plateaus and the walls of forgotten shelters, there are carvings and paintings that outlasted their makers by thousands of years. They have survived sandstorms' heat and the slow disintegration of everything around them. To stand before them now is to look through a window that time has tried to close. The figures are faded, their pigments dulled by the centuries, but they're still clear enough to read if you learn how to listen to them. They speak not in words but in images, in gestures, in the way a line curves to suggest movement or water or hope. They are the oldest storytellers of the desert, and they speak of a Sahara that once breathed with rain and life. The most famous of these ancient artworks are found in places like Tassili Naja in southeastern Algeria, a vast plateau of sandstone rising from the desert floor. From a distance, the landscape looks alien, jagged, sculpted by wind into arches and spires. But hidden in its canyons are tens of thousands of paintings and engravings. Some are small and simple, others stretch across the walls of caves and rock faces, filling the space with color and motion. They show a world that feels impossible compared to the desert around it. There are people swimming, rivers teeming with fish, cattle grazing under trees, elephants and giraffes walking through open grasslands. The people who made these images lived in a green Sahara thousands of years before it became a desert. Archaeologists have dated many of the paintings to between 10,000 and 4,000 years ago, a span that covers the region's last great humid period. In that time, rainfall transformed the Sahara into a mosaic of savas, lakes and wetlands. The people who lived there painted what they saw and what they valued. The result is a visual record of the landscape's transformation as well as of humanity's adaptation to it. What's remarkable about these carvings and paintings is not just their age, but their sophistication. The artists used mineral pigments, ochre, iron oxide, charcoal to create shades of red, brown, yellow and black. They use brushes made from animal hair or reeds and sometimes painted with their fingers. Some scenes are simple outlines, others show shading, perspective, and detail that suggest observation and patience. Even the placement of the figures seems intentional, arranged in sequences that may tell stories or mark events. In the earliest layers, the art is dominated by animals. Huge creatures, buffalo, elephants, rhinos, are rendered with precision, their muscles and horns carefully drawn. These were the inhabitants of the Green Sahara, the same animals that roam sub-Sahara and Africa today. Their presence tells us that this landscape once supported enough vegetation and water to sustain them. The artists likely saw these animals daily, perhaps hunted them, perhaps revered them. Some depictions show human figures smaller than the animals, suggesting awe or respect, or perhaps the simple scale of reality. Over time, the focus of the art changes. As the climate began to shift and herring took root, cattle appear in abundance. They're drawn in herds, sometimes accompanied by figures holding ropes or sticks, sometimes alone, surrounded by geometric patterns. The cattle scenes are so common that archaeologists call this phase the pastoral period. It represents a time when human life in the Sahara revolved around livestock, herring, milking, and moving with the seasons. To the people who made these paintings, cattle were not just food. They were a measure of wealth, a source of identity, and perhaps even a bridge between the earthly and the spiritual. Some of the rock art shows what appear to be rituals involving cattle, figures gathered around a central animal, arms raised or bodies painted. It's impossible to know exactly what these scenes meant, but they hint at early forms of ceremony, of shared belief. The repetition of the imagery suggests continuity. People were returning to the same places, performing the same acts, reaffirming their connection to water, animals, and one another. Among the most famous figures from Tassili Naja is one often called the Great God of Sefer, or the Horned God. It shows a large human-like figure with outstretched arms and horns, or a headdress extending from the head. Around it, smaller human figures seem to dance or reach upward. Some researchers see it as evidence of a belief system, an early expression of religion. Others interpret it more cautiously, as symbolic, perhaps representing fertility, rainfall, or leadership. Whatever it meant to its creators, it shows that these people were already thinking in abstract terms, connecting the cycles of nature to forces beyond themselves. And it wasn't just in Algeria. Across the Sahara, from the Tibesti Mountains in Chad to the Anaidi Plateau and the Akas of Libya, similar scenes appear. Herds, hunters, ceremonies, and symbols that repeat across vast distances. The consistency suggests communication, or at least shared ideas, even separated by hundreds of kilometers. The artists spoke the same visual language. It's one of the earliest examples of cultural unity across a continente's landscape. As the centuries passed and the climate grew drier, the art changed again. The large animals disappeared from the imagery, replaced by camels and horses. These belong to a later, more arid phase when the desert as we know it began to take shape. The shift in subject matter marks not just environmental change, but human adaptation. The people adjusted to the drying world, trading cattle for camels, changing their routes, their habits, their gods. Yet they continue to carve and paint, as if to record the transition, to leave a message for those who would one day find only sand. Many of the paintings also include geometric designs, circles, spirals, grids, and dotted patterns. Their meanings are uncertain, but they may represent maps, stars, or symbolic systems tied to the cycles of rain. Some researchers think the circles could mark watering holes or sacred sites. Others see them as purely decorative. But the persistence of these motifs across thousands of years suggests something deeper, a pattern of thought repeated by generations who saw meaning in the landscape's shapes. In a sense, these carvings are the Sahara's first written language. They record not just what happened, but how people understood it. Each line and curve encodes experience, what animals looked like, how people dressed, what they valued. There's no alphabet here, no grammar in the modern sense, but there's a structure of communication as clear as any script. To look at a wall of ancient paintings is to see a conversation frozen in time between humans and their world. Some scenes go beyond the physical and enter the symbolic. There are images of figures with masks or strange elongated heads painted in ways that make them seem otherworldly. A few appear to float or to radiate lines from their bodies. These have often been sensationalized, interpreted as depictions of gods, spirits, or even extraterrestrial visitors. But most archaeologists see them differently. They likely represent ritual states, dance, trance, or ceremony, moments when people felt connected to forces larger than themselves. They might depict shamanic experiences, the kind found in many early cultures where the boundary between the material and the spiritual was porous. To the people who lived here, rain was not just a weather event. It was life returning from the sky. It determined when herds could graze, when crops could grow, when travel was possible. It's no wonder so many of their carvings and paintings seem to revolve around it. Some figures are shown with lines descending from above, interpreted by some as rainfall, by others as rays of power or light. In either case, they reflect an awareness of dependence on something both essential and unpredictable. To live in a landscape governed by the rhythm of rain is to live in constant negotiation with the heavens. When researchers analyze the pigments and techniques used in these artworks, they find layers of history literally stacked atop one another. In some caves, newer paintings overlap older ones, each generation adding its own story. Sometimes the newer artists respected the old images, painting around them. Other times they repurposed the space entirely, turning an elephant into a camel or a river scene into a caravan. These overlaps are like geological strata, showing how culture evolves alongside the climate. As the environment changed, so did the imagination. What these carvings and paintings also reveal is that memory can survive even when everything else disappears. The artists of the Sahara didn't know they were preserving history. They were recording moments important to them. Successful hunts, changing seasons, rituals of gratitude. But because the desert dried so completely afterward, those moments endured. The same dryness that took away the rivers protected the images that once depicted them. Now they are the desert's memory etched into its skin, and they're still teaching us. By comparing the animals shown in the art with the fossil record and climate data, scientists can reconstruct the timeline of the Sahara's transformation. The presence of aquatic species like fish and hippos indicates lakes and rivers. The later dominance of cattle and camels shows the shift to drier conditions. Even the style of the artwork, the pigments available, the themes chosen tracks the environment's evolution. In a sense, the people who painted the Sahara left behind both an artistic and a scientific record. To walk among these paintings today is to feel something almost contradictory. The silence of the desert presses in, and yet the walls around you speak of noise, of herds and rainstorms, of laughter and ritual. The wind moves through the canyons, and for a moment it's possible to imagine that sound as a continuation of their voices. Archaeologists who have spent years studying these sites describe the experience as haunting but comforting. The art doesn't feel dead, it feels paused. Elsewhere in the Sahara, lesser known but equally striking examples of rock art have been found. The Anidi Plateau in Chad holds thousands of engravings depicting giraffes, cattle, and humans. Some are etched so deeply that the grooves still catch the light like new carvings. In Libya's Messac, immense panels of engraving stretch across open rock faces, showing processions of animals and symbols that may have marked routes or territories. Together, they create a map of meaning across the desert, a network of sacred or communal spaces tied together by shared imagery. These sites were not isolated creations, they were part of a living landscape of expression. People returned to them over generations, adding new layers, reinterpreting old symbols. They were gathering places not just for water and trade, but for stories. In the absence of written language, art became continuity. Each mark reaffirmed identity and belonging. Even as the desert expanded and the rains withdrew, people kept returning to carve and paint, as if by doing so, they could hold on to the memory of abundance a little longer. Eventually, the climate's change became irreversible. The grasslands gave way to sand, the rivers to dust. The artists moved on, their descendants carrying fragments of their culture into new regions. The rock art remained behind, untouched but not forgotten. Millennia later, when the first explorers stumbled upon them, they could hardly believe that such beauty could exist in such emptiness. The irony is that the art itself proves the desert was never truly empty. What lingers in these carvings is more than just depiction, it's intention. Each stroke, each figure carved into stone, represents a choice to remember. In that way, they are humanity's earliest attempts to outlast impermanence. They show that the impulse to record, to make sense of the world through symbols, existed long before writing, long before cities. The people who painted the Sahara were already historians in their own way, leaving behind a visual archive of how they saw themselves in relation to the land. Some of these images still carry traces of color, their pigments clinging stubbornly to the stone. The reds and browns are warm against the pale rock, the blacks deep and quiet. Under sunlight, the colors shift slightly, almost as if they breathe. It's a reminder that these were once living expressions, not relics. The people who made them might have laughed as they painted, or argued over placement, or told stories as they worked. Each scene was probably a communal effort, an act of remembering together. When you look at one of those walls closely, you can sometimes see where the artist's hand hesitated, a small correction, a thicker line. In that moment, the distance of millennia collapses. You can feel the presence of another human being, focused, deliberate, alive. The Sahara's carvings are above all evidence of connection. They connect us to a time when life and art were inseparable, when recording the world was as natural as living in it. And beyond the carvings themselves lies another layer of mystery, the way they align with the natural world around them. Some panels are oriented towards specific horizons, where the sun rises or sets during solstices. Others face ancient riverbeds or the directions of prevailing winds. It's as if the art was meant not just to be seen, but to exist in harmony with the landscape, to mark time, to measure change, to remind. All across the desert, the stones still hold that reminder. They whisper of rain that once fell here, of lives that flourished where now only silence remains. The carvings speak of adaptation, of continuity, of people who refuse to let their world disappear without leaving a trace of its memory. And somewhere within those memories, the story begins to turn again, from the art on the walls to the people who made it, and to the shifting climate that would one day erase their world. For even as they carved their stories into stone, the winds of change were already rising. The rains grew scarce, the lakes retreated, and the horizon began to shimmer with heat once more. What followed would reshape not only the Sahara, but the course of human history itself. In the vastness of the Sahara, where dunes stretch like waves and wind hums across ancient rock, there are shapes that do not belong to chance. Circles of stone laid out by deliberate hands thousands of years ago rest in quiet alignment beneath the blazing sky. They sit half buried in sand, their edges worn by time, their meaning uncertain but unmistakably intentional. These are the stone circles of the desert, the forgotten architecture of a world that existed before the desert we know took hold. At first glance, they seem simple. Rings of rocks, sometimes a few meters wide, sometimes sprawling across entire ridges. Some are solitary, others appear in clusters, forming networks that stretch across kilometers. To anyone stumbling upon them today, they might look like the remains of campsites or perhaps the foundations of ancient dwellings. But as archaeologists studied them more closely, it became clear that these circles were far more than random arrangements. They were built with care, often with a sense of symmetry and orientation that hints at purpose beyond shelter or convenience. One of the most remarkable examples lies in the southwestern desert of Egypt at a place known as Nabta Playa. Here, on the flat expanse of an ancient dry lake bed, archaeologists discovered a group of megalithic structures that predate Stonehenge by more than 1,000 years. When the site was first examined in the late 20th century, it appeared as little more than scattered stones. But when researchers began mapping their positions, patterns emerged, patterns that suggested planning, astronomy, and ritual. At the heart of Nabta Playa is a circle of standing stones about 4 meters in diameter. The stones are rough, unshaped, and modest in size. Yet their placement is anything but random. Some align with the cardinal directions, others point towards specific positions on the horizon where the sun rises and sets during solstices. When the alignments were tested against astronomical data, the results were striking. Around 7,000 years ago, the stones would have marked the summer solstice, an event that signaled the onset of the rainy season in the region. For the people who lived there, this was not just a date, it was a promise of survival. The builders of Nabta Playa were herders and early farmers, people who had already learned to read the land and sky. Their livelihood depended on knowing when the rains would come, when to move their cattle, when to gather. The stone circle in that context was more than a monument. It was a calendar, a tool for predicting the rhythms of the earth. Each solstice, each shift in the stars carried meaning. In marking it, they were connecting their lives to the wider cycles of the planet. Around the central circle are other stone arrangements, lines, clusters, and small mounds that may have served as ceremonial or burial sites. Excavations revealed hearths, pottery fragments, and bones, all evidence of gatherings that took place here seasonally. People traveled long distances to Nabta Playa, drawn by the promise of water when the playa filled during the wet months. It was a meeting place, both practical and spiritual. When the rains came, the lake formed a shallow mirror reflecting the sky above. In that reflection, the stones would have seemed doubled. Earth and sky joined in symmetry. It's easy to imagine how that site could become sacred. The stones themselves were not sourced from nearby. Some were carried from several kilometers away, hauled across the plains by human hands. That effort alone suggests that the site held deep importance. You don't move tons of rock through the desert, unless what you're building matters, and what they built has endured, not because of size, but because of precision. Even now, thousands of years later, the alignments remain accurate, a silent testament to knowledge that predates writing by millennia. Nabta Playa is not alone. Similar, though less well-known stone circles have been found across the Sahara and Sahel, each with its own mysteries. In the Adra Plateau of Mauritania, near the edge of the desert's western expanse, there are dozens of circular and oval stone structures, some containing burial chambers, others forming open enclosures. Their age varies, but many are prehistoric, dating back to the same era as Nabta Playa. The patterns repeat: symmetry, alignment, deliberate construction. Some circles even appear to mirror constellations, suggesting that the connection between sky and stone was widespread, not isolated. Further north, in the Fezzan region of Libya, archaeologists have documented hundreds of small cairns and circular stone enclosures scattered across ridges and plains. Many are burial sites containing human remains and grave goods, beads, pottery, tools. The dead were laid to rest in the same patterns that guided the living. Circles marking both life and death. It's a geometry that recurs again and again throughout human history. A circle has no beginning and no end. In a landscape where everything seems temporary, a circle promises continuity. The circular form also appears in more subtle ways in hearths, in storage pits, in the layout of ancient campsites. Some researchers suggest that this repetition reflects more than practicality. It may represent a worldview, a sense of belonging to cycles, the day, the year, the life, the rain, the drought. For the people of the Green Sahara, the circle was not just a shape. It was a reflection of their environment, where everything moved in patterns that repeated, though never exactly the same. Beyond their symbolic or astronomical roles, the stone circles may also have served social functions. In many early societies, gathering places were central to identity. They were where groups met to trade, to form alliances, to share news and rituals. The circles of Nabta Playa and elsewhere could have been such meeting grounds marked permanently in stone, so that even as landscapes changed, the memory of gathering remained fixed. A traveler crossing the plains would know the direction of the circle, the time of year when others would come, the significance of the solstice or the flood. In a world without borders or writing, the stones were landmarks of meaning. Archaeologists studying Napa found another layer of complexity beneath the surface. Buried in the sand nearby were the remains of what may have been huts or small structures, suggesting longer stays. There were also traces of cattle bones carefully placed in pits, possibly offerings. These finds point toward ritual, toward acts of devotion or gratitude tied to water and fertility. The builders of these circles were not merely marking time. They were engaging with it, acknowledging its power. The knowledge required to construct these alignments was significant. To identify the solstice, you must observe the horizon over many years, noting where the sun rises and sets. To fix that, observation in stone requires planning, cooperation, and memory, passed from generation to generation. These were not casual undertakings. They were expressions of accumulated wisdom, of a relationship with the land that was both scientific and spiritual. As the Sahara began to dry again around 5,000 years ago, sites like Nablier were gradually abandoned. The lakes shrank, the grass withered, and the people moved on. But the stones remained. They outlasted the culture that built them, outlasted the rivers that once reflected them. When the desert finally closed over them, they waited in silence until the modern age uncovered them again. The rediscovery of these circles in the 20th century forced historians to rethink the timeline of human development. For a long time, complex structures like these were assumed to have originated in Europe or the Near East. The idea that people in the heart of Africa long before the pharaohs could have built observatories and ceremonial centers challenged old assumptions. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The Sahara's megaliths are among the world's earliest examples of human attempts to understand and record cosmic order. Even more intriguing is how these early African structures may have influenced later developments. As people migrated eastward toward the Nile, they carried their knowledge with them. The concept of aligning the earthly with the celestial, the habit of marking sacred space with stone. When Egyptian builders raised the first temples and tombs, they continued that tradition, orienting their monuments toward the stars. The lineage of those alignments can be traced back through time, from the pyramids to the circles buried in the desert, elsewhere across North Africa, and into the Sahel. Stone monuments continue to appear long after the Sahara dried. In Sahel and the Gambia, thousands of later stone circles dot the landscape, dating from the 1st millennium BCE. Though much younger than Nabta Playa, their persistence shows how deeply the idea of circular stone markers had taken root across time and geography. The form endured, connecting generations who never met but shared a sense of the world's continuity. The simplicity of the stone circle is deceptive. It looks primitive by modern standards, but it represents a complex understanding of balance, observation, and cooperation. Build a circle in the desert requires not just tools, but agreement on where to place the stones, on what they mean, on who will maintain them. It requires a shared belief that something intangible like time or divinity can be fixed into something tangible like rock. In the silence of Nupta Plea, the stones still catch the light as the sun rises and sets, just as they did thousands of years ago. The horizon has shifted, the climate has changed, but the relationship between stone and sky remains. It's easy to imagine the herders who once gathered there, watching the same alignment, waiting for the first clouds of the rainy season to build in the distance. The desert would have smelled of dust and anticipation. The air would have been still, the sound of cattle low and patient, and then one morning the sun would rise exactly between the stones, and they would know it was time to move, to plant, to celebrate. The significance of such a moment cannot be overstated. It was knowledge encoded in the land itself, knowledge that bound people to place. The circle was both tool and temple, a convergence of observation and reverence. Even as the world changed around them, the stones anchored meaning. Modern science continues to study these structures using techniques like ground-penetrating radar and 3D modeling to map their alignments more precisely. Some discoveries hint that there may be additional buried stones forming extensions of the main circles, perhaps marking longer cycles or other celestial events. Others reveal the presence of nearby hearths and habitation layers, suggesting that life here was not purely ritual, but integrated with daily existence. Each layer uncovered deepens the sense that these sites were part of a living landscape of science, art, and faith intertwined. The more we learn, the more the stones seem to speak. They tell of people who watched the skies not out of curiosity but necessity, who found rhythm in chaos, who turned observation into structure. In their quiet endurance, they remind us that civilization did not begin with cities but with understanding. The first monuments were not built to kings but to the planet itself. All across the Sahara, beneath dunes and gravel plains, other circles may still lie hidden. Some are faintly visible from the air, subtle disruptions in the sand that form perfect rings when seen from above. Each discovery adds another chapter to the story of the people who mapped time in stone. And though their purpose can never be fully known, their intent is clear: they wanted to remember. The desert has done its best to erase them, but the geometry persists. Wind cannot scatter a circle. It can cover it, blur its edges, but the shape remains beneath. And in that persistence lies something deeply human, the desire to be part of something larger and longer than ourselves. The stone circles stand as markers of that desire. They do not shout, they do not crumble easily. They endure quietly, keeping their vigil over a landscape that once teemed with life. When the wind sweeps across them, it carries the same dust that once settled on the hands of those who placed each stone. The connection between then and now is invisible but unbroken. And beyond these circles, as the climate shifted and the last wet centuries faded into dryness, the people who built them faced a new reality. The rains grew less dependable, the grasslands retreated, and the lakes shrank into isolated pockets of water. What came next was a slow transformation that would change not only the Sahara's shape, but humanity's course. The desert was not born in a single moment. It arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a long exhale that never stopped. For generations, the people of the Green Sahara must have watched it happen without realizing what it would become. A few seasons of poor rain, a river that ran lower than usual, a lake that took longer to refill. These small changes were easy to accept at first, easy to adapt to. The earth has moods after all, and the people who live close to it understood that better than anyone. But then the pattern began to stretch. The seasons of rain grew shorter, the dry spells grew longer, the grass turned brittle, the dust lingered. Eventually the land began to shift beneath their feet, and the Sahara started its slow transformation into the desert we know today. The cause of that shift lay far beyond anything the people could see. It wasn't punishment or misfortune, it was astronomy. Earth's orbit around the sun is not constant. Over tens of thousands of years, the planet's tilt and shape of its path change slightly, altering how sunlight reaches different regions. These gradual variations, known as Milankovitch cycles, drive the great pulses of climate through history, the advance and retreat of ice, the greening and drying of continents. Around 6,000 years ago, those celestial rhythms began to turn again. The northern hemisphere's summers grew a little cooler. The monsoon rains that had once swept deep into the Sahara began to weaken and retreat southward. At first, the effect would have been subtle. The rains still came, just less predictably. Lakes shrank slightly each year, their shorelines drawing back like the edge of a receding tide. Rivers that had flowed wide began to fragment into shallow channels. Herds of animals moved farther and farther in search of water. For people living through it, the change might have seemed temporary. A drought, perhaps, something to endure. But the pattern didn't reverse. The green began to fade slowly but relentlessly. In sediment cores taken from ancient lake beds, scientists can trace this transformation grain by grain. Layers of clay and organic matter give way to sand and dust, marking the transition from wet to dry. Pollen trapped in those layers tells the same story. Grass species vanish, replaced by desert shrubs. Fossilized shells of aquatic snails disappear entirely, replaced by wind-blown grains carried from afar. The change wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. Within a few thousand years, a blink in geological time, the Sahara had crossed a threshold from savanna to sand. The shift did not happen evenly. Some regions dried faster than others. In the highlands, where mountains trapped the last threads of moisture, patches of green lingered for centuries. Oases formed where groundwater still reached the surface, creating islands of life amid an expanding sea of dryness. These oases became the last refuges for both people and animals. Communities that once roamed freely across open plains now clustered around these shrinking pockets of fertility, adjusting their lives to scarcity. At sites like Nabta Playa, the record of that adjustment is written in the ground. The stone circles that once aligned with the solstice stopped being maintained. The seasonal gatherings ceased. Paths and dwellings show signs of abandonment. People began to move on, their paths following the last traces of water eastward and southward. As they went, they carried their knowledge, their traditions, and their memory of a greener world. For scientists, this period marks one of the most significant environmental transitions in human prehistory. It reshaped not only the land, but the trajectory of civilizations. As the Sahara dried, populations that had once been scattered across its lakes and grasslands were forced to concentrate along permanent rivers and coasts. Nowhere was this more transformative than along the Nile. There, migrants from the desert brought with them skills honed by centuries of managing water and herds. They understood seasons, astronomy, and survival in marginal environments. When they arrived at the Nile's dependable floodplain, they found stability unlike anything the desert could now offer. Out of that stability, agriculture flourished, and from agriculture came cities, monuments, and kingdoms. The drying of the Sahara, in other words, didn't end a civilization, it moved it. The knowledge born of adaptation became the foundation for something new. What had once been pastoral wisdom became agricultural engineering. What had once been skywatching for rainfall became the science of calendars in a quiet, indirect way. The climate shift that created the Sahara also created Egypt. But for those who stayed behind, life became increasingly harsh. The shrinking lakes became salt flats. The rivers disappeared underground, leaving behind dry eddies that only carried water during rare storms. Sand encroached on once fertile valleys, burying evidence of former abundance. The people who remained had to adapt again, relying on wells, trading routes, and livestock that could endure the heat. The camel, though not yet domesticated during the earliest phases of desertification, would eventually become the key to survival, turning the Sahara from a barrier into a bridge once more. The climate shift also left its mark in the genetic and linguistic patterns of the people who descended from those migrations. Modern studies suggest that populations across North and West Africa, the Nile Valley, and even parts of the Middle East share ancestry linked to these ancient Saharan peoples. As the desert expanded, their descendants spread outward, blending with others, carrying fragments of their old world into new ones. Languages shifted, myths evolved, but the memory of a lost green land persisted. In some oral traditions from the Sahel and beyond, there are still stories of a place to the north where grass once grew high and rivers flowed endlessly, a place swallowed by sand. To imagine living through that transformation is to imagine a slow grief. Each generation would have known less water than the one before. Grandparents might have spoken of lakes that their grandchildren would never see. The sky would have seemed emptier, the rains later, the winds harsher. Over time, adaptation became resignation. Camps grew smaller. Travel became riskier. The once open corridors of migration turned to dunes. Yet even in that loss, there was ingenuity. People learned to dig deeper wells, to use every drop efficiently, to track underground aquifers by reading the patterns of plants and insects. They developed new tools and new routes of exchange, connecting distant oases through early trade. What had once been a land of abundance became a land of endurance, and those who mastered it became some of the most resilient communities on Earth. For scientists today, studying this climatic transformation helps reveal how interconnected the planet's systems are. The Sahara's drying was not an isolated event. It was linked to shifts in monsoon patterns, in ocean temperatures, and even in vegetation feedback loops. As the grasslands disappeared, the bare reflected more sunlight, which in turn altered atmospheric circulation, further reducing rainfall, a chain reaction that locked the desert in place. This feedback loop is one reason why the Sahara has remained so stable in its aridity for the past several thousand years. Once the balance tipped, it was difficult to reverse. The transformation also had ripple effects far beyond Africa. Dust blown from the newly formed desert carried nutrients across the Atlantic, fertilizing the Amazon rainforest. In a sense, the Sahara's loss fed another ecosystem half a world away. The Earth, as always, redistributes. When one region dries, another blooms. The cycles of life and death in nature are rarely local, they are planetary. Even today, traces of the Sahara's green past remain hidden beneath its surface. Satellite imagery reveals old drainage systems, buried rivers, and the outlines of ancient lakes. In the northern Sahara, the sediments of long-vanished basins still contain fossils of fish and shells. In the central regions, petrified wood lies scattered across the ground, trees that once grew tall in places that haven't seen a drop of rain in centuries. These relics remind us that the desert is not static. It has changed before, and it will change again. The same orbital cycles that dried the Sahara will in time shift again in 10 or 15,000 years. When Earth's tilt and orbit align differently, the monsoons will return. Rain will once more sweep across the dunes, carving new rivers, filling new lakes, and turning the desert green again. The process will be slow, but inevitable. The Sahara breathes on a timescale far beyond ours. Centuries for each inhale, millennia for each exhale. The people who lived through the last transformation were witnesses to one breath, caught between the fading of one world and the birth of another. The record of that transition isn't only in sediments or fossils, it's in the art, the tools, and the architecture left behind. As the rains withdrew, so did the animals they depicted. In later rock paintings, elephants and hippos vanish, replaced by camels and horses. The change in imagery marks the moment when adaptation became necessity. The people who painted those walls were recording the death of an era, perhaps without realizing it. To them, it may have felt like weather. To us, it's history written in pigment. Archaeologists can even trace the emotional tone of that shift. Early pastoral scenes are lively and open, figures dancing, cattle grazing, rivers flowing. Later works become more restrained, more linear, as if the joy of abundance gave way to the discipline of survival. The landscapes in those paintings look sparse, the animals are fewer. Yet even then the act of painting continued. The people didn't stop recording their world, they changed the subject. The climate shift also transformed the meaning of places. Sites that had once been centers of community became memorials. The stone circles of Napa, the carvings of Tilai, the settlements along the vanished rivers, all became markers of what was lost. Later travelers may have encountered them without understanding their origins, treating them as sacred simply because they were old. In that way, the memory of the Green Sahara survived not as fact, but as reverence. In modern times, as scientists study these ancient changes, they see echoes of our own era. The pace is different now, faster, driven by human activity rather than orbital cycles. But the pattern is familiar: shifting rainfall, expanding deserts, the movement of people in search of water. The past becomes a mirror for the present, showing how fragile even vast ecosystems can be when balance is disturbed. The difference is that the people of the past could move with the climate. We, bound by borders and cities, face a different challenge. Still, there is a kind of comfort in knowing that the Sahara has been many things. It has been a forest, a savanna, a sea of lakes, and now a desert. It reminds us that nothing in nature is final. Even what seems eternal is in motion. The dunes that stretch endlessly today will one day lie beneath grass again, and perhaps somewhere on that future plain someone will find the buried remains of our time. The traces of roads and buildings, as strange to them as stone circles, are to us. For now, the Sahara sleeps in its dry phase, its rivers turn to dust, its lakes to salt. But the story of that shift, of the slow transformation that changed everything, is still being written in the wind. The sand moves, the climate breathes, and beneath it all the memory of rain waits. And beyond that waiting lies another mystery. What happened when the Sahara's people finally left? Where did they go, and what did they build when they arrived? The desert's silence ends at the edge of the Nile, where the next chapter of human history begins, and the seeds carried out of the fading green world took root in a new one. As the Sahara dried and the last of its great lakes disappeared into dust, people who had once known the rhythm of rains and the wide sweep of green plains began to move. They did not move all at once. The transition was gradual, a long migration that unfolded across generations. Families followed the retreating water, herders searched for new pastures, and traders traced the old riverbeds toward the east, where one river never failed. The Nile became the great thread that gathered the scattered lives of the Sahara into something new. The river was constant, even when the world around it changed. Every year it rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, flooding the land and leaving behind a ribbon of fertile soil. For those who arrived from the desert, it must have seemed miraculous. After years of unreliable rain and shrinking lakes, here was a waterway that renewed itself season after season. It was not just a place to live, it was stability itself. The people who settled along its banks did not arrive as blank slates. They carried with them the knowledge of the land they had left behind. They understood water and the cycles that governed it. They had learned to measure time by the stars, to mark the solstices and track the seasons. They had herded animals built with stone and honored the patterns of nature through art and ceremony. When they reached the Nile Valley, they applied that same intelligence to a new environment. What emerged over time was not merely a community but the seed of civilization. Before cities and temples, before pharaohs and writing, there were small villages. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mimi Farm and Badari show settlements that appeared along the Nile around 6,000 years ago. They were modest clusters of huts surrounded by fields of barley and emmer wheat. The people farmed, fished, and raised cattle just as their ancestors had done in the Green Sahara. They built granaries to store their harvests and dug channels to guide the floodwaters. These early farmers did not invent agriculture from nothing. They adapted it from what they already knew, transforming the knowledge of hearing and seasonal movement into the practice of settled life. The rhythm of the Nile shaped everything. When the floods came, the fields disappeared underwater, and work turned to waiting. When the waters receded, they left behind rich black silt that could grow crops without fertilizer. Life became a cycle, dependable and predictable, mirroring the cosmic order the desert people had once observed in the stars. In that predictability, society found its foundation. Trade flourished early. The Nile was not just a river, it was a highway. Boats made from papyrus reeds carried goods between villages, grain, pottery, fish, and stone tools. From the south came gold and ivory. From the north came salt and shell ornaments from the Mediterranean coast. The connections that once linked the Sahara's oases now followed the river's course. Communities grew not in isolation but in communication. Ideas like goods traveled easily on the water. As populations increased, so did complexity. Larger settlements developed specialized crafts, pottery, weaving, tool-making. The control of water became more organized. Simple ditches turned into irrigation networks. Leadership evolved naturally from necessity. Someone had to decide when to open and close the channels, when to plant, when to harvest. Authority, at first practical, became symbolic. Those who managed water managed life. The desert past was never forgotten. The earliest Egyptian symbols for life, fertility, and rebirth are often tied to water and the sun. The same forces that had governed existence in the Sahara. The circle, a form that dominated the old desert monuments, reappears in Egyptian iconography as the sun disk, as the shape of eternity. Even the orientation of early temples and settlements reflected the same fascination with celestial cycles that once guided the builders of Nabtaplaya. Civilization along the Nile grew from the same impulse to understand the world by aligning with it. By around 4000 BCE, small regional cultures had developed along different parts of the Nile. In the south, in what is now Upper Egypt, communities like Nikkada and Hercompolis became centers of innovation. They built larger houses from mud brick, buried their dead with grave goods, and decorated pottery with images of animals and boats. In the north, in Lower Egypt, other groups thrived near the delta. The two regions developed distinct identities, but the river connected them, ensuring exchange and eventual unification. The transition from scattered villages to organized society was gradual but unmistakable. The knowledge of how to work with nature deepened. People learned to predict the Nile's flood with remarkable accuracy, using the rising of certain stars as a guide, most notably Sirius, whose first appearance in the dawn sky each year coincided with the beginning of the inundation. This link between the heavens and the earth, between astronomy and survival, became the backbone of Egyptian thought. The idea that the cosmos had order and that human life should reflect that order shaped everything from architecture to religion. By the time the first kings emerged, ruling small territories along the river, the groundwork for empire had already been laid by centuries of adaptation and migration. The leaders who unified Upper and Lower Egypt were inheritors of a long chain of knowledge passed down from the people who had once built stone circles in the desert. They understood that power was not only control over people, but mastery of the environment. The irrigation of fields, the storage of grain, the enlightenment of temples, all were extensions of the same principle: harmony with the cycles of the world. The deserts that flanked the Nile on either side became both barrier and memory. To the west lay the Sahara, vast and silent, its green past long buried. To the east stretched the Red Land, harsh and dry. The Egyptians called their fertile valley the Black Land after the color of its soil. The contrast defined their worldview. Life and death, fertility and barrenness, order and chaos. These were not abstract opposites, but reflections of the geography they lived in. The Sahara's transformation had written duality into their landscape, and from that duality came mythology. Even the gods they created carried echoes of the desert past. Hether, one of the oldest deities, was often depicted as a cow, an image that links directly to the pastoral cultures of the Green Sahara. The reverence for cattle, visible in rock art thousands of years older than Egypt's first temples, found new form in religion. The sun god Ra rising and setting each day embodied the same cyclical time that desert herders once tracked in the solstices. The god Osiris, whose death and resurrection mirrored the annual flooding and retreat of the Nile, carried within him the same understanding of renewal that governed life in the vanished grasslands. It's easy to think of civilization as something that begins suddenly with walls, writing, and cities, but along the Nile it grew like a slow tide swelling from the collective experience of people who had been adapting for millennia. Their mastery of stone, their understanding of stars, their relationship with water, all were legacies of the Sahara. The empire that would one day raise pyramids began not with kings but with communities shaped by climate. In the oases that dotted the western desert, life continued even after the Great Migration eastward. These small green pockets became stepping stones between worlds, the last remnants of the Sahara's once vast network of lakes. Places like Dhaka, Kar, and Siwa became centers of exchange, linking the Nile Valley with the deeper desert. Traders passed through them carrying salt, gold, and stories. The people who remained in these oases preserved traditions that reach back to the Green Sahara. Pottery styles, burial customs, even certain cattle rituals. Long after the desert had swallowed most traces of its former self, the oases kept fragments of memory alive. Over time, those oases also became points of expansion for the growing Egyptian state. Expeditions ventured westward in search of minerals, trade routes, and contact with neighboring peoples. The desert was no longer home, but it was never forgotten. Its silence became sacred, its dangers mythologized. The concept of the western horizon, the place where the sun died each evening, became associated with the realm of the dead. To enter the desert was to move toward mystery, toward origins. In that sense, the Sahara remained part of Egypt's consciousness, not as geography, but as history written into belief. The evolution from oasis culture to empire is not just the story of Egypt. Similar transformations occurred wherever the drying Sahara pushed people toward more reliable water sources. Along the Niger, early settlements took root that would one day become centers of civilization in West Africa. In the Treb, coastal communities grew, trading with Mediterranean cultures while maintaining inland ties. The desert acted as both divider and connector, separating regions yet shaping them through shared heritage. When archaeologists piece together the fragments of this transformation, they find continuity rather than rupture. The tools of the desert herders and the farmers of the Nile share forms and materials. The burial practices evolve gradually, not abruptly. The orientation of sacred spaces toward the sun, the stars, the horizon, remains consistent across time and distance. It's as if one long conversation continued through generations, changing dialect but never subject. Modern research continues to reveal how deep those connections run. Isotopic studies of human remains from both the Sahara and early Egyptian sites show similar diets and mobility patterns consistent with migration from west to east. Genetic evidence supports this, too, indicating shared ancestry between populations of the ancient Sahara and the Nile Valley. These findings transform what was once speculation into a coherent narrative. The people who gave rise to one of history's greatest civilizations were in part the descendants of those who watched the Sahara turn to sand. The shift from oases to empire also transformed how people thought about time. In the desert, time was cyclical, measured by the rains and the stars repeating endlessly. In the Nile Valley it became both cyclical and linear. The floods repeated, but the society built upon them accumulated knowledge, power, and monuments. The sense of continuity expanded into ambition. The pyramids, when they came, were extensions of the same impulse that once placed stones in a circle to mark the sun. But now the gesture reached upward, monumental, declaring that understanding the heavens could also mean joining them. What began as adaptation ended as mastery. The people who had once moved with the climate now shaped it to their will. They diverted rivers, built dams, and stored food against famine. Yet even as they conquered the land, they never lost awareness of its fragility. Egyptian religion was filled with warnings about balance, about maintaining Mahat, the harmony of the world. Perhaps this belief, so central to their identity, was inherited from ancestors who had seen what happens when balance fails. The story of how the Sahara's people became the architects of civilization is not only about progress, it's about continuity. The slow accumulation of understanding passed hand to hand from the green plains to the banks of the Nile. Each step along the way was a response to change. Each adaptation carried within it the memory of what came before. When the first empire rose, it did not rise from nothing. It rose from the desert's memory, from the oases that sustained life when the world around them faded, from the quiet persistence of people who refused to vanish. And as we follow their journey through time, the next part of the story turns to the landscapes they left behind, the vanished lakes and ghost valleys that still lie beneath the sand, silent witnesses to the ages when water ruled and the desert had not yet learned to forget. Beneath the dunes of the Sahara lie the shapes of lakes that no longer exist. Their outlines are faint but persistent, drawn in sediment and stone, invisible from the ground but perfectly clear from above. They appear in satellite images as pale depressions, ghostly ovals and basins that once shimmered with water. To imagine them full again, blue against green grasslands, is to glimpse the Sahara as it once was a place of abundance, not absence. These are the vanished lakes and ghost valleys of the desert, the remnants of a time when water was the author of every story told here. The largest and most famous of these lost waters was Lake Chad, long before it shrank into the small body we know today as Lake Chad. It was an inland sea vast enough to rival the Caspian or the Great Lakes of North America. At its peak around 6,000 years ago, it covered nearly 400,000 kilometers, stretching across what is now Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Its waves touched shores hundreds of kilometers apart. The air above it would have been heavy with moisture, its surface dotted with islands where people fished, gathered plants, and made camp. To those who lived along its shores, it must have seemed endless. Sediment cores taken from the former lake bed tell the story of its rise and fall. Layers of clay and silt alternate with sand and dust, marking cycles of flooding and drying. Embedded within those layers are the remains of freshwater mollusks, fish bones, and even the pollen of aquatic plants. In some places, ancient shorelines are still visible, a raised ridge of pebbles or a band of shells running across the landscape like the outline of a memory. From space, these ridges trace the contours of the old waterline, the last whisper of a lake that hasn't existed for millennia. When scientists mapped these formations, they realized how dramatic the transformation had been. The modern Lake Chad, which fluctuates between 1 and 2,000 kilometers depending on rainfall, occupies less than 1% of its ancient extent. The difference is staggering, a reminder of how quickly climate can redraw the map of the world. Yet, the ghost of the lake remains, not only in geology, but in culture. Many local traditions still tell of a great water that once filled the land, a memory passed down through countless generations. The people who lived along Chad's shores left behind artifacts that speak of adaptation and community. Stone tools, pottery fragments, and fish hooks carved from bone have been found buried in the sediments of the old lake bed. They reveal a society that thrived on the water's bounty, fishing, gathering, and herring along the floodplains. As the lake began to retreat, these communities followed its shrinking edge, moving with the water as it pulled back toward the center. Their migration routes became invisible lines connecting the ancient and modern landscapes. Further north, other vanished lakes tell similar stories. In what is now Libya, the Pheasant Basin once held a network of lakes and rivers that fed into one another, forming an interconnected system. During the Sahara's green periods, this basin was alive with wetlands and forests. Fossilized remains of fish, hippos, and crocodiles found there confirmed that it was once a thriving aquatic world. In the Uber Sand Sea, a chain of saltwater oases known as the Mandurah Lakes are all that remain of that system. These small, shimmering pools are the descendants of a once vast expanse of fresh water that sustained life for thousands of years. The evidence of these lakes isn't only found in sediments, it's written into the land itself. Dry valleys known as wadis snake across the desert floor, riverbeds that haven't carried water in thousands of years. Some are so large that they can only be fully traced from space. Their channels wind and branch just like living rivers, complete with tributaries and deltas. One of the most significant of these is the Wadi Taman Rasset, which stretches from the Hoga Mountains in southern Algeria all the way to the Atlantic coast of Mauritania. In the past, it was a mighty river, possibly rivaling the Niger in size, carrying water from Central Africa to the ocean. Today, its course lies buried beneath hundreds of meters of sand, visible only as a shadow in radar imagery. When geologists examined satellite data from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, they found the unmistakable signature of this ancient river system. The T-Manet was not a single channel, but a network, a web of tributaries collecting rainfall from across the central Sahara. During the last wet period around 10,000 years ago, it would have been a corridor of life connecting lakes, forests, and human settlements across what is now one of the most desolate regions on Earth. The river's delta still exists beneath the Atlantic, a submerged fan of sediments that marks where fresh water once met salt. For archaeologists, these ghost rivers are not just geological curiosities, they're clues to where people once lived. Along their ancient courses, remnants of tools, hearths, and rock art have been found, suggesting that humans followed these waterways just as animals did. The rivers were lifelines, highways of movement and exchange. When they dried up, the patterns of human settlement shifted with them, forcing communities to adapt or relocate. The process of disappearance was neither sudden nor uniform. Some lakes evaporated completely. Others left behind saline residues that turned into shimmering salt flats. A few became oases fed by the groundwater that still flows beneath the desert. These oases are in a sense the living ghosts of the vanished lakes, fragments of a system that once covered millions of square kilometers. When you stand at an oasis today, surrounded by palms and listening to the trickle of water, you're standing in the shadow of an ancient shoreline. Scientists studying the Sahara's hydrology have discovered that much of this hidden water still exists underground. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, one of the largest freshwater reserves on the planet, stretches beneath Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Sudan. It contains water that fell as rain tens of thousands of years ago during the last humid phase. In some places, wells tap into it, drawing up water that has not seen the surface since before civilization began. This fossil water is a direct connection to the Sahara's green past, a reminder that the desert's transformation was not total, only surface deep. In certain regions, ancient shorelines are so well preserved that they can be mapped in 3 dimensions. Using satellite radar, scientists have reconstructed the contours of long-lost lakes, revealing deltas islands and even the paths of ancient rivers that once fed them. These digital models allow researchers to simulate the Sahara as it was a landscape of interconnected basins, a network of wetlands stretching across half a continent. In that simulation, the desert disappears, replaced by green and blue. It's a vision of a world that feels both alien and deeply familiar. The ghost valleys of the Sahara, dry rivers that once flowed with life, also tell the story of the desert's heartbeat. Some of them, like Wadi Howe in Sudan, were still active as recently as 5,000 years ago. Wadi Howe once connected the central Sahara directly to the Nile, serving as a corridor for animals and people. Archaeological finds along its course include pottery, tools, and animal remains, evidence of settlements that flourished along its banks. When the river finally dried up, it left behind a trail of memory that can still be traced across the sand. Each of these vanished waterways played a role in shaping human migration. When they disappeared, they pushed life toward the edges of the desert. Communities that had once been scattered across a wide landscape concentrated around remaining sources of water. The Nile, the Niger, the highland oases. The ghost rivers became the boundaries of new worlds, lines that divided abundance from desolation. Yet even as they vanished, they left something behind. Fertile soils enriched by millennia of sediment. In places where rainfall occasionally returns, those old valleys can still bloom briefly after storms. Their ancient fertility reawakened for a few short days, before fading again. From the air, the Sahara looks static, but these hidden rivers and lakes reveal a landscape in motion. It has changed more times than we can count, shifting between extremes of wet and dry, abundance and absence. The desert silence hides that dynamism. Beneath its stillness lies a record of transformation as intricate as any rainforest or ocean. Every dune, every dry basin is part of that record, an archive written in sand. Some scientists believe that if the climate shifts again, the Sahara could one day reclaim its rivers. The same orbital patterns that once brought rain will eventually return. Already, small hints of moisture have begun to reappear in certain areas. Occasional grass growth, unexpected ponds after rare storms. These are not signs of imminent transformation, but reminders that the desert story is cyclical. The ghost valleys are not dead. They are dormant, waiting for the next breath of the planet to wake them. For now, the Sahara's lakes survive only in memory and myth. In the oral traditions of tribes that still cross its expanse, stories persist of hidden waters, of underground seas, of wells that never run dry. These tales often point to real locations where groundwater still lies close to the surface, suggesting that cultural memory has preserved knowledge long after the landscape itself changed. The desert may have taken the lakes, but it could not take the idea of them. Walking across the dry basins today, you can sometimes find small traces that reveal what once was. Pebbles rounded smooth by waves that have not touched them in 10,000 years. Layers of white salt crust glinting in the sun, the last gift of vanished water. Fossilized fish bones scattered among the dunes. Each fragment is a whisper of an ecosystem erased by time but not forgotten by the earth. And then there are the patterns invisible to the eye but readable by technology. Satellite radar and LiDAR have become the new tools for rediscovering the lost hydrology of the Sahara. With them, scientists can peer beneath the sand to reveal entire networks of ancient channels, deltas, and basins. These discoveries not only rewrite the desert's history, but also expand our understanding of how human civilization developed. Many of the earliest human sites align closely with these hidden rivers, confirming that people followed the water wherever it went. When the rivers vanished, they followed them underground, metaphorically and literally, learning to tap wells and find moisture in the most unlikely places. In this way, the Sahara's vanished lakes and ghost valleys continue to shape the present. They influence where people live, where trade routes form, even where vegetation can grow after rare rains. Their presence beneath the surface affects the temperature of the ground, the flow of wind, the patterns of dunes. The desert, though it appears uniform, carries within it the structure of its former self. To imagine standing on the shore of one of those ancient lakes is to imagine a different planet. The horizon would have been green, the air filled with the sound of insects and birds. Herds of animals would have come to drink, and people would have built their camps along the water's edge. The reflection of the sky and the lake would have stretched for kilometers, turning sunrise and sunset into vast, shifting mirrors. The smell of wet soil, the movement of reeds in the wind, the laughter of children at the edge of the water. All of it gone now, replaced by silence and heat. Yet somewhere under the sand, the memory persists. The desert's ghost lakes remind us that change is the rule, not the exception. What feels permanent is only paused. The dunes will move, the winds will shift, and perhaps one day the rains will return. When they do, the water will seek the same paths it always has, filling the old valleys, tracing the lines carved long ago by rivers that refuse to be forgotten. The desert will bloom again, not because it was conquered, but because it was always capable of renewal. And as we trace these lost waters, following their buried courses through rock and sand, we begin to approach the next part of the story, the echoes that linger not in stone or sediment, but in human memory. For even as the lakes vanished and the valleys dried, their presence lived on in the stories people told, in the myths that crossed generations, in the spoken history that carried the memory of water long after the desert had taken it away. The sand remembers. It may not hold words, but it keeps stories in other ways. Buried fragments of pottery, the outlines of old hearths, the shapes of vanished rivers. Yet not all memory lives in the earth. Some of it survives in people carried in voices, in songs, in the quiet repetition of tales told under the same stars that once reflected in ancient lakes. When the water disappeared and the dunes began to rise, the people of the Sahara carried more than tools and cattle with them. They carried memory. Over time, that memory turned into story, and story became myth. Across North Africa and the Sahel, echoes of the Sahara's greener past linger in oral traditions that have outlasted geography. Among Tuareg, Berber, Tubu, and Fini communities, stories still speak of lands that were once full of rivers and forests, of ancestors who lived beside great waters that no longer exist. These aren't tales of imagination alone. They are recollections softened and reshaped by centuries of retelling, but grounded in real landscapes that time has changed beyond recognition. In some versions, the lakes are described as gifts from the gods, vast shining mirrors dropped from the sky. In others, they are described as living beings, generous but easily angered, retreating underground when humans grew careless. The moral shifts with each culture, but the theme remains constant. Water once abundant withdrawn because of imbalance. To people whose world depends entirely on rain, such myths are more than allegory. They are memory, given moral form. Among the Tuareg, whose ancestors have crossed the central Sahara for centuries, there are stories of a great river that once flowed through the desert, connecting distant lands. Some elders still speak of traces of this river visible after certain storms, lines of green that appear briefly when the sands shift just right. Modern scientists call this the Tamret River, a buried channel mapped only recently through satellite radar. But for the Tuareg, it has always been known as a river of the past, but as a hidden one, a presence just beneath the surface, asleep but not gone. It's the same with tales of underground seas, which appear in the oral histories of communities from Mauritania to Sudan. Many of these stories describe wells that reach deeper than memory, their waters cool and ancient, drawn from sources said to be alive. When geologists discovered the Nubian sandstone aquifer, one of the largest underground freshwater reserves on Earth, it felt less like revelation and more like confirmation. The people who lived on this land had known about its hidden water all along. They might not have had the words for aquifer, but they had the knowledge. The desert had whispered it to them through experience. These oral histories are not just cultural artifacts. They are maps of survival in a landscape where written records vanish. Stories become navigation tools. A tale about a spirit who guards a spring might, to a listener, mark the location of that spring. A myth about a sleeping lake might correspond to an area where groundwater still lies close to the surface. Over centuries, memory wrapped itself in story, so that even as generations passed, the knowledge remained useful. In parts of the Sahel, there are still songs sung during the rainy season that speak of water returning to its home, of rivers waking from sleep. The imagery matches what the land itself does during rare heavy rains. Dry valleys become torrent overnight. Old rivers briefly reclaiming their purpose before drying again. The people who live there sing not just in celebration but in recognition. They're greeting an old friend who visits rarely now but once lived among them. Even the rhythms of certain traditional dances echo the landscape cycles. Among the Bode, for instance, ceremonies held after rainfall mimic the movement of water and the wind. The gestures are slow, deliberate, repetitive, like ripples forming and fading. These rituals performed for centuries may seem purely aesthetic, but they are reminders of dependence, gratitude, and continuity. They carry fragments of the time when such ceremonies were not symbolic at all, but expressions of direct connection with the environment. As researchers began recording these oral traditions in the 20th century, patterns emerged. Different groups separated by vast distances and languages shared remarkably similar motifs of lost rivers, hidden wells, vanished rains, and migrations that followed the retreat of water. The consistency suggests a shared origin, possibly dating back to the period when the Sahara was still habitable. As the desert expanded, these stories traveled outward with its people, adapting to new landscapes but retaining their core. The universality of these themes extends beyond Africa. Across the world, ancient cultures tell of floods, of lost paradises, of water withdrawing or returning in cycles. The Sahara's oral history fits into this broader pattern, a local expression of a global truth that water defines the boundaries of memory. When it leaves, it takes more than life. It takes familiarity. What remains is the urge to explain, to preserve, to remember through story. Some myths speak not of loss, but of endurance. In the oasis towns that punctuate the desert, Siwa Gate, Janet, legends persist about wells that were never dug by human hands, springs that flow from the touch of ancient beings. These tales often center around acts of kindness or balance. A traveler shares water with a stranger, and the ground opens in gratitude. Or a community forgets to honor a spring, and it dries up until respect is restored. In a region where water is sacred by necessity, these stories carry both moral and practical weight. They teach reverence for the resource that defines existence. What makes these oral traditions remarkable is not only their persistence, but their accuracy. When geographers compare certain myths to modern hydrological maps, correlations appear. A tale about a well that sings may describe the sound of air echoing in deep limestone shafts. A story about a sea that hides beneath the dunes align with known aquifer locations. The past preserved through story often anticipates scientific discovery. It's a reminder that knowledge doesn't always require instruments. It can live in language shaped by observation and necessity. In many ways, these myths are the emotional continuation of the landscapes that disappeared. When the lakes and rivers went silent, their voices moved into story. The people kept speaking for them, keeping their presence alive in narrative form. To this day, some desert travelers pour a small measure of water into the sand before drinking, a gesture of acknowledgement of the land itself, as if sharing with the spirits of those old waters. In the stillness of the Sahara, such acts are both prayer and remembrance. There are also stories of migration told not as history but as prophecy. In some traditions, ancestors are said to have been guided by stars or spirits toward new lands when the rains failed. The descriptions of these journeys align strikingly with the actual routes of ancient migrations from the Sahara to the Nile and beyond. The travelers in these tales carry cattle, seeds, and fire, crossing wastelands that were once meadows. Each version ends with arrival at a river, a mountain, a forest, and with the message that adaptation is part of identity. The desert teaches movement as a form of survival. The oral histories also preserve the emotional truth of climate change in ways that scientific data cannot. They describe not just what was lost, but how it felt to lose it. In some songs, there's mourning for the rains. In others, there's awe at the power of the sun. The tone is never just sorrow, it's acceptance. The desert is not the enemy. It's part of the same rhythm that gave and took away. Listening to these stories, you can hear how deeply the people who lived here understood impermanence. They didn't deny it. They found meaning in it. Even in the most barren corners of the Sahara today, where dunes stretch unbroken to every horizon, traces of these memories linger in names. Many place names translate to words like valley, spring, lake, or rain. They are linguistic fossils surviving evidence of what the land once was. A traveler moving through these areas unknowingly speaks the names of vanished waters, repeating them like incantations. The map itself has become an archive of the past. Some researchers studying these oral traditions believe that they may help locate still undiscovered archaeological sites. By following the geographic clues embedded in myths, scientists have identified areas where ancient lakebeds or settlements might lie buried. The collaboration between local storytellers and modern researchers has led to discoveries that neither could have made alone. It's a rare partnership between two kinds of memory, scientific and cultural, each confirming the other. The persistence of these stories across millennia also raises a deeper question about human memory itself. How far back can oral history truly reach? Can a story survive 10,000 years? In the case of the Sahara, the evidence suggests it can. The physical changes in the landscape happened slowly enough that each generation could pass its knowledge to the next. The result was a chain of memory stretching across epochs long enough to carry the image of a green desert into a world that no longer recognizes it. In that sense, the Sahara's myths are not only records of the past, they're time machines. They transport fragments of lived experience across ages, compressing history into narrative. When a modern storyteller speaks of a river that sleeps beneath the sand, they are echoing voices that once heard that river flow. The continuity is almost unimaginable, yet it exists. An unbroken thread of human awareness binding us to an environment that is transformed completely. And perhaps that's why the desert feels so heavy with silence. It isn't emptiness, it's density. Every grain of sand covers a story. Every windstorm rearranges the surface of memory. The people who still move through it, guiding caravans or tending oases, walk across the graves of rivers and the whispers of lakes. They live among echoes, some scientific, some spiritual, all part of the same conversation between human beings and the planet they inhabit. Even now, new stories continue to join the old ones. Climate change brings new patterns to the desert, new uncertainties, new hopes. The people who live at its edge still look to the sky, still measure time by clouds and stars, still teach their children the names of winds. The myths evolve with the landscape, adapting as their ancestors did. The memory of water becomes the dream of its return. When you listen to these stories told in tents around fires or beneath the open sky, you begin to sense that they aren't about the past at all. They're about continuity. The desert may change, but the relationship between people and place endures. The lakes may vanish, but their reflections live on in words, in customs, in the way travelers greet the dawn with quiet gratitude. The Sahara is still speaking through those who remember how to listen. And beyond these human voices, there is the land itself, where traces of lost worlds continue to reveal themselves through science and chance. The next step in this journey lies in the meeting of those two realms. The stories passed by generations and the discoveries made by modern eyes, both converging on the same truth. That beneath the sand, the Sahara is not dead, only hidden. Beneath the Sahara's endless dunes, under layers of sand that shift with every gust of wind, lie traces of structures built by hands long gone. Not just hearths and tools, not mere camps or scattered stones, but the outlines of places where people lived together, planned, built, and perhaps even dreamed of permanence. To speak of cities beneath the desert might sound like legend, the kind of rumor told by caravan guides and explorers seeking mystery in the vastness. But there are signs, unmistakable signs, that long before the Sahara became a desert, its green plains may have held the first blueprints of urban life. The idea of hidden cities in the Sahara is not new. Travelers through the ages have whispered about them. Ancient Greek and Roman writers mentioned lost towns swallowed by sand, describing the desert as a place that conceals as much as it reveals. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as imagination, myths inspired by mirages. But with modern science, those stories have begun to take on a new dimension. What the ancients saw or thought they saw might not have been entirely untrue. When satellites began scanning the Sahara from orbit, they revealed a landscape far more complex than anyone had guessed. Beneath the dunes are patterns, grids, alignments, rectangular anomalies that cannot be explained by geology alone. Some of these are ancient river deltas, but others show the regularity of construction. Archaeologists studying radar and infrared data have identified dozens of such sites, most buried under tens of meters of sand. To the eye, the surface looks untouched. To the sensors, it's a palimpsest, a surface written over again and again by wind and time. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from the southwestern edge of Egypt near what was once the Great Gil-Kabir Plateau. In satellite imagery, researchers noticed a cluster of rectangular outlines arranged with an order that suggested human design. The area lies deep in what is now one of the most remote corners of the desert, hundreds of kilometers from any settlement or modern road. When expeditions reached the site, They found fragments of pottery, tools, and foundations made from stone blocks buried in the sand. The layout was unmistakable. Streets or pathways intersecting at right angles, courtyards surrounded by walls, and the remnants of what may have been storage rooms or dwellings. It wasn't a mirage, it was a settlement, one that had been covered for thousands of years. The age of these structures is difficult to determine precisely. Radioarbon dating of organic material from nearby layers places them somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago, during the final centuries of the Sahara's last humid phase. In that time, the region was fertile enough to support cattle herders, farmers, and communities who gathered near seasonal lakes. What makes this discovery extraordinary is its scale. It suggests not a temporary camp, but a settled community, a place built to last. Similar finds have emerged elsewhere. In Niger, near the Air Mountains, archaeologists have found traces of large stone enclosures and what appear to be streets lined with circular dwellings. In Chad, near the ancient basin of Mega-Chad, ground-penetrating radar has revealed buried walls stretching for hundreds of meters, their straight lines cutting across the irregular patterns of the natural landscape. These aren't random. They are intentional, geometric, and human. When scientists compare the distribution of these sites to the paths of ancient rivers, a clear pattern emerges. Every major buried settlement sits near what was once a water source, either a river, a lake, or an oasis. The people who built them knew exactly where to live, placing their homes where water was most reliable. As the rivers began to dry and the lakes retreated, these cities would have been abandoned gradually, each generation moving closer to the last remaining water until there was none left. Then the sand arrived, slow and patient, erasing the rooftops, the walls, the streets. The wind became the caretaker of what remained. Some of these buried structures are so well preserved that scientists can still see their outlines clearly from satellite imagery. In one site in Mauritania, circular stone foundations overlap in clusters, suggesting neighborhoods or family compounds. The arrangement resembles the layout of early farming villages found in the Nile Valley, hinting at a shared cultural heritage. If confirmed through excavation, these sites could represent the missing link between the Sahara's pastoral cultures and the first urban centers of North Africa. The challenge, of course, is access. Excavating in the Sahara is not like working anywhere else. The heat can melt equipment. The sand shifts unpredictably, burying camps overnight. Windstorms erase tire tracks and footprints within hours. Even finding a site once it's been located from orbit can be a challenge. Coordinates on paper mean little in a sea of identical dunes. Many discoveries remain unvisited, known only through data and imagery. The desert guards its secrets closely. Still, progress continues. Using techniques like synthetic aperture radar and magnetometry, researchers can now peer beneath the surface without disturbing it. These methods have revealed what traditional archaeology never could: a hidden map of human presence stretching across thousands of kilometers. The Sahara, once thought empty, is revealing itself as one of the richest archaeological landscapes on Earth. Its cities buried not by collapse, but by climate. Some of the findings challenge long-held assumptions about when and where complex societies first formed. For decades, the narrative of civilization has centered on river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. But the evidence emerging from the Sahara suggests that people here may have begun building organized communities just as early, perhaps earlier. The same forces that later shaped Egypt, the management of water, the observation of the sky, the creation of shared spaces, were already present in the desert's green centuries. Civilization, it seems, was not born in one place, but in many, wherever people learned to work with the rhythms of nature rather than against them. There's another dimension to these discoveries: the possibility of preservation. The dryness of the Sahara, though it destroyed life, has also protected what life left behind. Organic materials that would have decayed elsewhere, wood, bone, even textiles, can survive for millennia under the sand. In some excavations, seeds have been found intact. grains of ancient cereals that once filled storage pits. In others, fragments of leather, beads, and carvings have emerged, untouched since the day they were buried. The desert is both tomb and archive, destroying and preserving at once. For those who study ancient architecture, the design of these buried settlements offers insight into how people adapted to the environment. Houses were often semi-subterranean, built partially below ground to stay cool. Walls were thick, sometimes lined with mud or clay to retain moisture. In larger structures, narrow alleys provided shade and channeled wind for ventilation. Even in their earliest forms, these designs reveal an understanding of climate-responsive building, a skill that modern architects still study today. The presence of organized layouts and communal buildings also suggests social complexity. These were not isolated families, but coordinated groups working together to build and maintain shared spaces. Some areas within the sites appear to have been used for storage, others for gathering, perhaps for rituals or decision. The architecture mirrors the social structure, interdependent, cooperative, balanced between individuality and community. It's easy to forget that such sophistication existed before the written word. When we picture early human life, we often imagine scattered tribes and temporary shelters. But the Sahara's buried cities remind us that the desire for permanence, for structure and belonging, is ancient. Even when the environment was unpredictable, people sought to build places that could endure. There are legends, too, that seem to echo these buried realities. In Mauritania, there's a story told of a city called Zuzura, said to lie hidden among the dunes, a place of white walls and running water, where birds sing and palm trees grow. The legend has persisted for centuries, passed among desert nomads and recorded by travelers from the Middle Ages onward. For a long time, Zuzura was dismissed as myth, a mirage born of longing for water. But when archaeologists began uncovering evidence of ancient settlements in the very regions where the legend placed it, the line between myth and history blurred. Perhaps Zuzura was never a single city, but a memory of many carried forward in story long after their stones were buried. The pattern repeats across cultures. In Sudan, oral traditions speak of buried towns where the spirits of the old people still live, invisible but present. In Libya, elders tell of the houses beneath the wind, a phrase that describes both the ruins under the dunes and the way sand reshapes them, building over and uncovering them like waves. These stories might not name dates or rulers, but they preserve the emotional truth of a civilization erased by climate. Modern researchers now face a delicate balance: how to explore without destroying. Excavation in such fragile conditions can easily disturb what time has preserved. Some advocate for non-invasive mapping only, letting the desert continue its role as guardian. Others argue that we must uncover and study these sites before erosion or human activity damages them further. The debate reflects a broader question about how we engage with the past, whether to leave it undisturbed or bring it into light, knowing that the act of discovery always changes what is found. Each new image, each radar scan, adds to a growing understanding of a world once thriving, where now there is only silence. The Sahara, so often portrayed as barren, was once one of Earth's great centers of life and innovation. Its hidden cities are proof of that, remind us that human ingenuity flourished long before recorded history began. They remind us that civilizations don't always end with war or collapse. Sometimes they simply sink beneath the sands, waiting for the wind to shift. The dunes themselves are restless keepers. Every year they move slightly, their slow migration exposing new fragments and covering others. A shard of pottery might lie hidden for thousands of years, then emerge one morning in the sun, perfectly preserved. A carved stone might appear at the edge of a dune, only to vanish again with the next storm. The desert reveals and conceals in equal measure, as if reluctant to surrender its secrets all at once. When you stand in such a place with the wind humming low and the heat rippling the air, it's impossible not to feel the presence of what lies beneath. The sand may look empty, but you can sense the geometry beneath your feet, The buried walls, the rooms filled with dust instead of people, the courtyards where children once played and elders once gathered. The silence is thick with memory. What's most haunting is how these hidden cities connect to the greater story of humanity. They show that civilization is not a sudden invention, but a continuous thread stretching back through time, linking one adaptation to another. The people who built under the Green Sahara laid foundations not just in stone, but in thought. They understood cooperation, planning, and resilience, the same traits that would later shape the empires of the Nile and beyond. Their cities may be gone, but their ideas endured, carried forward through migration, absorbed into new worlds. And as we trace their remains through satellite data and shifting sands, we begin to see the desert not as a void, but as a mirror. Beneath its surface lies the reflection of every civilization that ever learned to live with change. Each buried city is a message written in silence, reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found again. Beyond these ruins, farther beneath the dunes and deep into the desert's memory, lie even older mysteries. For in some places, the sand covers not only human cities, but the fossils of entire ecosystems, forests, rivers, creatures that roamed long before people ever arrived. The Sahara's story stretches far beyond humanity, into the deep time of the planet itself. And to understand what the desert hides fully, we must follow that trail even further back into the age when it was not a land of sand, but a world of giants. Seen from space, the Sahara does not look empty. It looks alive, almost fluid. From orbit, the desert is a canvas of motion, ridges curling like waves, valleys twisting in slow spirals, ancient riverbeds frozen mid-flow. To the naked eye on the ground, the Sahara seems endless and uniform, but from above, patterns begin to emerge. They are vast and intricate, traces of a world that once thrived here. In the language of satellites and sensors, the desert speaks of its own past, revealing what the human eye cannot. The first time astronauts looked down on the Sahara, they were struck not by its emptiness, but by its complexity. Instead of a flat sea of sand, they saw layers of color, red, gold, brown, and even violet, straying shadows. Some of those lines are dunes. Others are the scars of ancient rivers, now dry for thousands of years. Under the bright sun, the dunes form ripples like fingerprints, delicate yet massive, shaped by wind patterns that have repeated for millennia. In satellite images, these lines look like veins running across the body of the continent, carrying the memory of water long gone. One of the most extraordinary features visible from space is the Risha structure in Mauritania, sometimes called the Eye of the Sahara. From orbit, it appears as a perfect spiral, concentric rings of rock and sediment, nearly 50 kilometers across. For a long time, scientists thought it might be the impact crater of a meteorite. Later research showed it to be a natural geological formation, a dome of rock eroded over millions of years. But even knowing that, the image of it remains mesmerizing. It is an eye staring upward through the sand, a reminder that the desert watches back. Elsewhere, the satellite view reveals subtler signs of life and loss. In parts of Chad and Niger, faint lines curve through the desert, like the threads of a forgotten tapestry. These are the outlines of old shorelines where waves once carved ridges into the earth. Around the basin of ancient Mega-Chad, these ghostly arcs form a pattern so precise that scientists can map the rise and fall of the water level over thousands of years. Each line marks a different era, each curve a new boundary between land and lake. Together they create a portrait of time itself written in sediment. Modern technology has made it possible to read the Sahara in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Synthetic aperture radar, which can penetrate sand, reveals hidden structures, buried river systems, ancient deltas, and the foundations of settlements lost beneath the dunes. Infrared sensors detect variations in temperature that mark underground rock formations or former lake beds. LAR, which uses pulses of light to measure distance, creates detailed topographic maps that show the desert's subtle shapes in 3 dimensions. Every new technique uncovers another layer of the past, When these data sets are combined, they form something like an X-ray of the Earth, a transparent image showing not just the surface, but the bones beneath. What emerges is a Sahara that is not a wasteland, but an archive. You can see the channels of rivers that once connected Central Africa to the Mediterranean. You can trace the footprints of migration routes, the paths of early trade, the shapes of lost lakes that once mirrored the sky. The desert becomes a palimpsest of human and planetary history, every layer overlapping the next. In some satellite images, you can even see the faint color differences between ancient vegetation zones. Where forests once stood, the soil is darker, richer in organic residue. Where grasslands dominated, the ground reflects sunlight differently. These invisible tones tell the story of how the Sahara's ecosystems changed over time, how climate sculpted not just the land but the lives that depended on it. The precision is astonishing. Scientists can track the expansion of the desert almost year by year, seeing how dunes encroach on valleys, how the shapes of sand seas shift like tides. It is change made visible from orbit. You also see the patterns created by human hands, both ancient and modern. The long, straight lines of caravan routes cut across the dunes connecting oases that have existed for thousands of years. The dark patches of old settlements dot the edges of these routes, often clustered near dry riverbeds or wells. In some cases, you can see the remains of fields, rectangular plots carved into the ground, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They are the ghosts of agriculture from an age when rain was dependable, when the Sahara fed rather than forbade. One of the most striking discoveries made through satellite imagery is the scale of the ancient river systems hidden beneath the desert. The Wadi Taman Rasset, stretching from the Central Highlands to the Atlantic, is only the largest. Others branch northward, joining the basins of the Niger and the Nile. These networks show that the Sahara was once a crossroads of water, not a barrier. Rivers connected people and ecosystems across thousands of kilometers. Their dry channels still shape the movement of wind and sand today. Invisible architects of the modern desert's form. Scientists studying these rivers have found evidence that they may still carry water deep underground. In radar images, certain channels show signs of moisture, suggesting that ancient flow paths continue to guide groundwater movement. This hidden water supports modern oases, linking the present directly to the past. The same channels that once hosted fish and reeds now feed date palms and wells. The continuity is quiet but profound. From space, even the dunes themselves reveal patterns of history. They are not random. Each sand sea or urg has its own structure determined by prevailing winds, topography, and the remnants of older landscapes beneath. Some dunes align with buried valleys. Others form spirals around ancient highlands. In places you can see where the wind has carved the edges of long-buried cliffs, exposing rock strata that tell stories millions of years older than humanity. The dunes are both creation and erosion at once, builders and destroyers in the same motion. Color too carries meaning. In satellite composites, the Sahara's palette shifts from deep rust red in the east to pale yellow in the west, with streaks of dark gray marking volcanic fields and basalt plateaus. These colors are not random decoration. They reveal the mineral composition of the desert, the chemical traces of ancient environments. Iron-rich soils mark former wetlands. Lighter sands trace the remains of ancient beaches. What looks from the ground like endless monotony becomes from orbit a mosaic of geological history. Some of the most powerful images come not from satellites, but from astronauts themselves. They describe how during passes over North Africa, the Sahara seems to change depending on the angle of sunlight. At dawn, it glows gold. At noon, it turns almost white, blinding in its brightness. At dusk, it deepens to copper and purple, the long shadows of dunes stretching for kilometers. In photographs taken from the International Space Station, the desert looks alive with texture, ridges and valleys forming patterns that resemble waves frozen in time. It is difficult to look at those images and not think of the ocean it once was, or the rivers that shaped it. For planetary scientists, the Sahara is more than a subject of archaeology. It is also a key to understanding other worlds. The dunes and dry valleys of Mars, for instance, bear an uncanny resemblance to those of the Sahara. When NASA rovers photographed the Martian surface, geologists on Earth compare the images to satellite data from the African desert. The same processes, wind erosion, sediment deposition, the traces of vanished water appear on both planets. The Sahara, in that sense, is a bridge between Earth's past and Mars's present, a laboratory of planetary memory. The patterns visible from space also help climatologists predict the future. By studying how the desert formed, scientists can model how it might change again. The distribution of dust, for example, plays a critical role in global weather. Each year, winds lift millions of tons of Sahara dust into the atmosphere, carrying it across oceans. From orbit, this movement appears as a pale veil stretching westward over the Atlantic. That dust fertilizes the Amazon rainforest and influences Hurak. It is the Sahara's way of staying connected to the rest of the planet, even in its apparent stillness. In some satellite images, you can trace the faint tracks of human migration that still follow ancient routes, roads, camel paths, and even footprints in certain areas create linear scars across the desert's surface. These paths often align with the same corridors used thousands of years ago. The desert may have changed, but the logic of its geography remains. From space, these lines of movement look like threads stitching together fragments of a forgotten world. There are moments when the satellite view reveals something almost unsettling: the precision of natural design. Patterns of wind-sculpted dunes echo the geometry of waves and cloud formations, following mathematical curves known as fractals. The same shapes repeat at different scales, from a few meters to hundreds of kilometers. It is as if the desert follows a hidden rhythm, an algorithm written by time and weather. For those who study these forms, the Sahara becomes not chaos, but order disguised as silence. Even the areas that seem most barren hold meaning. The vast gravel plains known as regs, which appear dull and featureless from the ground, glow differently under radar. They preserve ancient surfaces untouched by erosion, surfaces that have remained stable for hundreds of thousands of years. In them, scientists find traces of prehistoric climate cycles recorded in microscopic mineral changes. The Sahara's face from space is not a void, but a timeline, a physical record of planetary memory stretching back far beyond the reach of human history. When viewed this way, the desert's patterns begin to resemble something organic, a fingerprint, a neural network, a circulatory system. Each dune, each dry channel, each plateau is part of a larger structure, interconnected and dynamic. The Sahara is not simply a place, it is a process. Its patterns are evidence of motion paused, of forces still at work beneath the stillness. The more we study it, the clearer it becomes that even in its silence, it moves. The patterns seen from space also invite reflection on how small human history is compared to geological time. The cities buried beneath the sand, the vanished lakes and ghost valleys all fit within a brief interlude between two dry ages. From orbit, they are invisible, thin layers of memory on a planet that has changed endlessly before and will change again. Yet to know they are there, hidden in those patterns, adds depth to what we see. The Sahara becomes not just landscape, but story. And still, for all that satellites can reveal, much remains hidden. Technology can map shapes, but not lives. It can show where people built and where rivers ran, but not what they felt when the rain stopped or the sand began to move. For that, we have to listen to the echoes, the myths, the art, the enduring traces of culture that survived in other forms. The patterns from space are the outline. The human story fills it in. As more data is gathered, as resolution improves, the Sahara's hidden map grows sharper. Scientists now use supercomputers to model how the ancient rivers flowed, how the wind moved dunes, how people might have traveled between lakes. Each simulation adds another layer to the understanding of this lost world. And yet, even with all our technology, there is something humbling in the view. From space, the desert looks complete. It needs no explanation. It is vast, self-contained, both living and fossilized at once. The patterns we see are reminders, not revelations. They tell us that the Sahara was not always as it seems, that change is the only constant, that even the most unyielding landscapes hold memory. The lines of rivers, the spirals of rock, the waves of sand, all of them are sentences in a story written across the face of a continent. We read it now from above, piecing together meaning from shapes and colors. But the story itself has been there all along, waiting for someone to look down and listen. And as those patterns lead us deeper into understanding, they point toward a question that grows larger with every discovery. If civilization once began here in the heart of what is now a desert, could it happen again? Could life return when the cycles of the earth turn once more? To answer that, we have to look not only backward but forward to imagine the Sahara not as it was, but as it might be. When the balance shifts again and the desert breathes green, the Sahara looks permanent. From the ground it feels eternal, the dunes unchanging, the air unmoving, the horizon without memory. But permanence, like silence, is an illusion. The desert has been many things before this. It has been an ocean, a foresta network of rivers and lakes, a home to elephants, giraffes, and people who followed the rain. Every grain of sand was once part of something living. When you look closely, you can see that memory still shimmering beneath the surface. The Sahara is not frozen, it is paused, and if the Earth's rhythms continue, it will change again. The question is not whether it can, the question is what might rise when it does. The idea that civilization could begin twice in the same place feels almost impossible. But the evidence of the past suggests otherwise. The people who first built in the Green Sahara were not given a unique moment in time. They lived in one of the planet's recurring cycles, periods of abundance followed by dryness, rebirth followed by dormancy. The same astronomical patterns that brought the rains before will one day bring them again. The orbit of the Earth will tilt, the monsoon will strengthen, and the desert will bloom. It may take 10 or 15,000 years, but the transformation is certain. The Sahara breathes on a timescale beyond ours. When that time comes, the dunes will not disappear overnight. The change will begin slowly with small rains that linger longer each season. Grasses will appear first, growing in shallow valleys where water collects. Seeds buried for millennia will wake, their dormancy broken. Animals will follow the migratory birds first. Then herds of antelope and gazelle returning to new grazing grounds. Rivers will carve themselves anew along the old ghost valleys, guided by the same paths that water followed before. The buried channels mapped by satellites will once again fill with flow. The desert will turn from reflection to refraction, light scattering through green instead of gold. For humanity, such a transformation would not go unnoticed. By the time the Sahara begins to green again, we will have changed beyond recognition. Cities will rise and fall elsewhere. Technology will advance in ways we can barely imagine. But the principle will remain the same. Where there is water, there is life. And life, given time and stability, builds. It builds homes, communities, and meaning. Civilization is not a single event. It is a response to opportunity. The future Green Sahara would not be an untouched wilderness. It would likely begin as a patchwork, pockets of fertility surrounded by dry zones, scattered like islands in a golden sea. Early settlers would come to manage these new wetlands much as their ancestors did 10,000 years before. They would farm, herd, and perhaps rediscover the same principles that once shaped Nabtaplir and the ancient oases. But unlike those early peoples, they would arrive armed with the knowledge of everything that came after agriculture, engineering, climate science. Their challenge would be not to create civilization from nothing, but to create it wisely in balance with the cycles that made it possible. It's tempting to imagine the greening of the Sahara as a triumph, as nature restored. But if history teaches anything, it's that abundance is fragile. The last time the Sahara turned green, humans adapted to it, but also depended on it completely. When the climate shifted, they were forced to move, and their world dissolved into sand. The same could happen again, though in a far more crowded and interconnected age. A new Green Sahara would be both promise and test, a chance to rebuild, but also a challenge to sustain without repeating the mistakes of the past. Scientists have begun to model what that transformation might look like. Using orbital mechanics and climate simulations, they can predict the slow return of the African monsoon. When Earth's tilt increases again, the northern hemisphere will receive more summer sunlight. The equatorial heat will intensify, drawing moisture-laden air farther north. Rains will creep upward from the tropics, feeding rivers and lakes across the desert center. It will not be uniform. Some areas will flood, others will remain arid, but the overall pattern will be unmistakable. The Sahara will begin to pulse with life once more. Already there are hints of this future written in the present. In parts of the Sahel, at the southern edge of the desert, rainfall has begun to increase after decades of decline. Grasslands are slowly reclaiming territory lost to sand. Communities there speak of seasons that feel more generous, of wells filling a little faster each year. These are small signs, perhaps temporary, but they echo the beginnings of change seen in the geological record. Climate is patient but not static. The same forces that built the desert can undo it. If civilization were to begin again in the Sahara, it would likely follow familiar patterns. Water would dictate settlement, just as it always has. Villages would rise near the rivers. Fields would appear in the floodplains, and trade routes would form between oases. The same geography that once supported ancient life would guide the new. The difference would be awareness. The people of this future Sahara, whatever form humanity takes by then, would know they stand on the remains of older worlds. They would know that the green is temporary, that every abundance carries the memory of its loss. That awareness could shape how they live. In that sense, the next civilization of the Sahara would not be a repetition, but a continuation. The desert has already taught us everything we need to know about adaptation, resilience, and balance. The people who lived through its last transformation wrote those lessons in stone, art, and myth. We rediscover them every time we unear a tool, decode a painting, or trace a riverbed from space. The question is whether we will listen. Modern technology offers possibilities that ancient people could never have imagined. If and when the Sahara begins to green again, we will have the ability to guide it, to plant forests, restore lakes, and manage water with precision. Projects like the Great Green Wall, already underway in the Sahel, hint at what might come. Across thousands of kilometers, communities are planting trees to stop the spread of desertification. It is a small act against a vast backdrop, but it mirrors the same instinct that drove the first humans to settle here, to shape the land so it can sustain life. Some scientists and futurists have even proposed accelerating the process, using technology to bring the Sahara back to life sooner. Ideas range from large-scale irrigation and cloud seeding to solar-power desalination projects along the coast. The goal is ambitious: to transform one of the harshest environments on Earth into a carbon sink, a source of agriculture, and perhaps a new cradle of civilization. Critics call it unrealistic, others call it inevitable. Either way, the dream persists, echoing the deep memory of a time when the Sahara was green. Yet for all our knowledge, there is humility in this possibility. The desert is not an empty canvas waiting for us to paint upon it. It is a living system with its own rules, older and wiser than any human plan. To restore it fully, or to live within its rebirth, will require listening to those rules, understanding that cycles of dryness and abundance are not problems to be solved, but rhythms to be respected. The first Sahara civilizations learned that lesson by necessity. We might have to learn it again by choice. There's a kind of poetic symmetry in the idea of civilization beginning twice in the same place. The first time it rose from adaptation, humans responding to the environment's generosity and retreating when it withdrew. The second time, it might rise from understanding, humans returning to the environment with awareness of its cycles. In that way, history could complete its circle. The desert that once forced migration might one day draw people back. The rivers that vanished might flow again, and on their banks new cities might rise, built not in defiance of the desert but in partnership with it. From space, the future Sahara might again look like a mosaic of blue and green. The old river systems reawakened, the basins filled with water reflecting the sky. Satellites would capture the transformation as it unfolds. First patches of vegetation, then expanding networks of wetlands and forests. To future observers, it might look like a planet healing itself. To the descendants of those who once crossed this land, it would look like home. What would those future civilizations remember of us? Perhaps they would find our cities buried as we now find the ones beneath the sand. Traces of ambition and wonder scattered across a landscape changed beyond recognition. They might study our records and satellites as we study fossils and rock art, piecing together the story of how we lived and what we valued. And maybe if they are careful, they will see that the story was never about loss, but continuity, because that is what the Sahara teaches. Above all, it does not end. It changes. It turns its own destruction into preservation, its silence into memory. Every time it greens and dries again, it carries forward a little of what came before. Civilizations may vanish, but the knowledge they leave behind of how to live with the land, how to adapt to its breath, remains buried, waiting for rediscovery. If civilization were to begin twice in the same place, it would not be a repetition of history. It would be a reflection of learning. The dunes that once buried the past would cradle the future. The same winds that erased footprints would carry seeds. The same sky that once watched over cattle herders and astronomers would watch again, unchanged in its quiet attention. And as the cycle begins anew, perhaps humanity will recognize itself not as the master of the desert, but as its student. The Sahara has already shown what happens when balance is lost, and what can grow when it is found. If it becomes green again, the challenge will not be to build another empire, but to build endurance, to create a way of living that honors both the abundance and the silence that follows it. Somewhere beneath the dunes, the bones of old civilizations rest beside the fossils of rivers and the outlines of homes. They are the foundation not only of the past, but of what could come. The desert holds them in patience, waiting for the rain, for the return, for the chance to begin again. Civilization, after all, is not a place, it is a rhythm, and the Sahara even now is listening for the next note. Night falls differently over the Sahara. When the sun sinks beyond the dunes, the horizon does not darken immediately. It lingers, glowing faintly, as if the sky itself is reluctant to leave. The air cools slowly. The sand, which held heat all day, releases it in a soft exhale. The stars appear one by one, then all at once, too many to count. In that moment, the desert feels infinite, not in distance, but in time. It is as though every age that ever passed through it is still here, folded within the quiet. The Sahara at night is not silent, though it seems so from a distance. The wind moves like breath through the dunes, shaping them grain by grain. Small insects click beneath the sand, burrowing deeper as the temperature drops. Somewhere far off, perhaps miles away, a lone jackal calls into the darkness, and the sound carries farther than it should. The air here does not stop anything. It only stretches it thin. Every sound becomes part of the landscape, like the faint echo of memory. If you stand in the middle of this vastness, there is no horizon to hold on to. The sky curves down until it feels close enough to touch, and the ground beneath your feet feels like it could shift at any second. Everything is movement disguised as stillness. The stars wheel slowly, the dunes drift imperceptibly, and the earth itself tilts along its long orbit, drawing the future toward you one fraction of a degree at a time. The Sahara, for all its silence, is never asleep. It dreams. Its dreams are long and patient. They stretch across epochs. From when it was an ocean floor to when it was a forest. From when people built with stone to when they left only footprints that the wind carried away. The desert remembers all of it. It remembers the rivers that carved it, the rains that softened it, the voices that once crossed it. Those memories don't vanish. They lie beneath the surface, waiting for light or water, or curiosity to uncover them again. Scientists, explorers, and storytellers have spent centuries trying to read those dreams. Each grain of sand holds information: what rock it came from, how far it traveled, what wind carried it. Each fossil tells of climates that shifted long before humans learned to measure time. Each carving and ruin speaks of lives that adapted, endured, and changed. The desert is an archive too large for any single person to comprehend. It keeps its knowledge scattered, forcing us to piece it together slowly, humbly. From orbit, the Sahara glows faintly under the moonlight, its pale ridges stretching for thousands of kilometers. The same satellites that once mapped its lost rivers now watch over it in silence, capturing images of the dunes shifting, the dust lifting, the patterns evolving. It looks static, but even from space you can see motion, waves of sand moving like tides across a sea without water. To those who study it, these movements are data. To those who simply look, they are something close to breathing. When the wind rises, it doesn't howl the way it does in mountains or forests. It hums. It moves through the valleys between dunes in long, low tones, carrying warmth and cold together. Sometimes it feels as though the desk itself is speaking, not in words, but in rhythm. You can feel it more than hear it. Perhaps that's what the first people here understood instinctively, that the world doesn't speak our language, but it communicates all the same. You just have to be still enough to listen. In the places where the dunes part, where rock breaks through the surface, you can still find the remnants of the Sahara's green centuries. Petrified wood lies scattered like bones. Fossilized shells glint in the sun. Sometimes if you dig just a little, you find smooth pebbles that were once worn by the waves of an ancient lake. Each fragment is a sentence in the desert's long story. A sentence that doesn't end, only pauses. It's strange to think that all this emptiness was once crowded with animals, with plants, with people. But the emptiness itself is part of the story. It is what remains after the cycle turns. Every civilization, every forest, every ocean eventually gives way to silence. The Sahara shows that clearly without cruelty. It teaches by example that change is not destruction, but continuation. The desert doesn't erase, it transforms. It takes what was and turns it into what will be. The people who live along its edges today still carry that understanding. They move with the seasons, travel by stars, measure distance by the time it takes for light to fade on the horizon. Their traditions are quiet lessons in endurance. In their songs and stories, the desert is never simply barren. It is alive, conscious, aware. It tests, but it also teaches. To survive here is not to conquer, but to listen, to learn its moods and respect its boundaries. Modern science has only deepened that respect. The Sahara influences the entire planet. Its dust, lifted by winds each year, travels across oceans, feeding rainforests, cooling the atmosphere, affecting storms. The same grains of sand that once lay in rivers now drift into clouds, touching continents far away. The desert's reach is global. Even when it seems isolated, it participates in the Earth's balance. The Sahara dreams and the planet responds. There's a quiet symmetry in how this cycle works. The rain that once fell here now falls elsewhere, nourishing forests that depend on nutrients carried by desert dust. The trees that grow from that soil release carbon, shaping the air that drifts back over the Sahara. Everything connects. The desert is not an exception to life, it is part of its equation. If you imagine the desert's future, you can almost see its dreams taking shape again. The same valleys that now lie dry could one day fill with rivers. The same basins could cradle lakes. Seeds buried deep might bloom once more. The fossils of trees might become trees again. It sounds like fantasy, but it isn't. It's simply the planet's rhythm, long and slow, repeating. When it happens, people will return. They always do. Life will find the old roots, settle near the familiar waters and begin again. Perhaps that's the most humbling truth the Sahara offers, that nothing truly disappears. Civilizations end, languages fade, but the patterns remain, waiting for their turn. The desert keeps them safe, wrapped in sand and silence. When the time is right, it gives them back. The winds shift, the rains return, and memory becomes landscape again. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear that in the wind tonight. A faint promise beneath the constant motion, like breath in sleep. The dunes sigh softly, the sand slips over itself, and somewhere far beneath, water still moves deep and slow. The desert isn't dead, it is dreaming, and in those dreams are the traces of everything it has ever been. The first lakes, the herders who carved on stone, The hidden cities buried in time, the myths carried by travelers, the stars mirrored in the water's surface. All of it still exists here in a form that only the patient can read. The Sahara doesn't forget. It waits. One day, when the earth tilts again, and the cycle turns, this sea of sand will awaken. Rivers will flow where dunes once stood, the air will smell of rain. The stars will still be in their places, watching, and maybe on some quiet night, people will sit beside the new lakes, telling stories about the age when the desert slept. They will speak of how their ancestors once crossed an ocean of sand, following memory, guided by stars, carrying the idea that everything returns if you wait long enough. Until then, the Sahara remains as it is, vast, luminous, endlessly shifting. It teaches through stillness, reminding us that even in apparent emptiness, there is movement, connection, and continuity. The dunes will keep their slow rhythm, the wind will keep sculpting their edges, and beneath it all, the planet will keep turning. The desert dreams on, it always has. And somewhere in that dream, humanity still walks its ancient shores, listening to the whisper of time carried softly through the sand. Thank you for drifting through this journey tonight, for listening to the silence of the Sahara and the echoes of what it once was. These stories are small reminders that the earth is not static, that everything we stand on has lived other lives before ours. The desert, the oceans, the forests, they're all chapters in the same long memory. If this calm exploration helped you slow down or think a little differently about the world beneath your feet, you can stay close to it. Subscribe if you'd like to keep exploring with me. Every story here begins the same way, quietly, with a question about how the planet remembers itself. For now, rest easy. Let your mind wander like wind over sand. The earth is still turning, the dunes are still shifting, and somewhere in the dark, the desert is still dreaming. Good night. Sleep well.